There is a particular kind of silence that falls over a battlefield when the attacking army realizes it has made a mistake. Not the silence of ceasefire, not the silence of victory, something older and heavier than both. It is the silence of men looking at a wall they cannot break, of commanders studying maps that offer no comfort, of an army that moved faster than any in history, suddenly finding itself completely, humiliatingly stopped. That silence fell over eastern France in the autumn of 1944, and it fell hardest around a city that most American soldiers had never heard of before that summer, Metz, a name that, if you said it quickly enough, might sound almost like a mistake. A city of old stone and older walls, sitting on the Moselle River like something that belonged to a different century entirely. From the air, it might have looked almost peaceful, church spires catching the last of the autumn light, river bending southward, fields turning gold at the edges. From the ground it looked like the end of the world. George Patton, possibly the most aggressive, most impatient, most theatrically self-confident general in the entire Allied order of battle, had been stopped cold. His Third Army, which had swept across France at a pace that stunned even his admirers and terrified his enemies, had run headlong into a problem that neither speed, nor boldness, nor force of personality could solve. He had an army that wanted to fight in open country, and he was staring at a fortress that had been killing attackers for generations. This is the story of what happened next, and I want you to understand something before we begin, because this is not the story that most people tell when they talk about Patton, or about the summer and autumn of 1944, or about the grand sweep of the Allied campaign in Western Europe. Most of the stories from that period are stories of momentum, of armor crashing through hedgerows, of entire German armies dissolving, of towns liberated in hours, of a war that seemed, for one extraordinary season, to be moving toward its conclusion, like a tide that nothing could reverse. This story is different. This story is about what happens when the tide stops, when the wave breaks, when the most powerful army in the world parks itself in front of a city and discovers that courage, firepower, and the most famous general in the American military are not, by themselves, enough. It is also, if you look at it honestly, one of the most important stories of the entire European campaign, not because of how it ended, but because of what it revealed. It revealed the limits of supply, the limits of momentum, the limits of one man's iron conviction that willpower is the highest military virtue. And it revealed something about the nature of fortified ground that military commanders have rediscovered in every generation since the first walls were ever built. That a prepared defender in a strong position can make the most powerful attacker in the world pay an almost unbearable price. By the time American forces finally secured Metz, they had spent the better part of 3 months bleeding against its walls. The campaign that had begun with Patton confident of victory within days had become something that looked nothing like the war his reputation was built on. It had become a siege, a grinding, exhausting, cold, attritional siege. The kind of fighting that belongs to a different era entirely. Not the gleaming, fast-moving armored warfare of 1944, but something far more ancient. Something that the soldiers who built the very forts around Metz would have recognized immediately. There is a reason this battle does not receive the attention it deserves. It is not a comfortable story for anyone involved. It does not fit neatly into the narrative of Allied invincibility, of German collapse, of the inevitable march toward Berlin. It is a story of miscalculation, of overconfidence, of a supply crisis that a faster army created for itself by moving too boldly. It is a story of German defenders who, by any rational calculation, should have surrendered far earlier than they did, but who chose instead to hold on, and who, in holding on, extracted a cost that reverberated through the entire Allied campaign in the West. It is also, in all honesty, one of the most fascinating stories of the war, because within it you can find almost everything that made the Second World War what it was. The clash between the old world and the new, between medieval stone and modern armor, between an army that believed in motion as a fundamental military principle and a city that had been absorbing attacks since long before any of the men fighting over it were born. You can find extraordinary courage on both sides, and extraordinary mistakes, and the particular human tragedy of men dying for ground that will ultimately change hands, regardless of how hard they fight. So if you are settling in tonight, if you are finding a comfortable position and letting the day fall away, I am glad you are here. This is exactly the kind of documentary you came for, the kind that does not rush, that takes the time to sit with the complexity of what actually happened, rather than offering you a simplified version, with all the difficult edges smoothed away. We are going to walk through the entire campaign, from the euphoric breakout that preceded it, to the final, exhausted capitulation of the city's defenders. We are going to spend time with the maps, with the forts, with the supply lines and the mud and the cold, with the decisions made in headquarters and the consequences felt in the field. And I want you to stay with us for the whole journey, because the payoff is real. This is not a story that ends in failure. Metz did fall, eventually, and the Third Army did continue east. But it is a story where the victory itself raises as many questions as it answers, where the man holding the trophy has to ask himself whether the price he paid for it was the price he should have paid, whether a different set of choices, made earlier and more carefully, might have cost less, whether the most famous fighting general in the American army learned the right lessons, or whether he took from Metz exactly the wrong conclusions and carried them forward into the campaigns that followed. Those are the questions that make military history worth studying. Not just what happened, but what it means. Not just who won, but what winning cost, and whether there was a better way. If this is your first time watching this channel, we are grateful you found your way here. What we do is take the great, complicated, genuinely important stories of military history and give them the space they need to breathe. No shortcuts, no oversimplification, just careful, honest storytelling, built on the events as they actually unfolded. If that sounds like something you want more of, take a moment right now to subscribe, so you never miss what comes next. And if you are a returning viewer, welcome back. Get comfortable. The night is long, and this story is worth every minute of it. The autumn of 1944 is waiting for us. George Patton is somewhere east of Paris, moving faster than anyone thought possible, convinced that the war is almost over. Ahead of him, sitting in the bend of a river, an old city is preparing to prove him wrong. Let's begin. France, in the summer of 1944, was a country coming back to life. After 4 years of occupation, the roads that had once carried German columns westward now carried American ones eastward, and the difference was written on every face that watched from the roadside. Women pressed flowers into the hands of soldiers riding atop tanks. Old men wept without apology. Children ran alongside half-tracks until their legs gave out, and then stood in the dust and waved until the convoy disappeared over the next hill. It was liberation in its most immediate physical form, not an abstraction debated in Parliament or announced over the radio, but something you could touch and smell and hear, the grinding treads and roaring engines of an army that had broken free and did not intend to stop. The mood inside those vehicles matched the mood on the streets. These were men who had spent weeks pinned inside the hedgerow country of Normandy, fighting for every field and lane, and now the ground was opening up before them like a door kicked off its hinges. The man most responsible for that door was George Smith Patton, the commanding general of the United States Third Army, and he was unlike anyone else in the Allied order of battle. He was vain and profane, brilliant and impulsive, a student of military history who could quote Caesar and Frederick the Great from memory, while simultaneously driving his staff to exhaustion with demands they considered impossible. He believed, with the conviction of a zealot, that speed was the supreme military virtue, that an army in motion was an army that controlled the terms of the fight, and that hesitation handed the initiative to the enemy as surely as any defeat in the field. He had been humiliated and sidelined after a notorious incident in Sicily the year before, stripped of command while his peers advanced, and the fury of that enforced idleness had curdled into something very close to obsession. When the Third Army was finally activated in August of 1944, Patton was not merely eager, he was volcanic. The breakout he inherited began with Operation Cobra, the massive American effort to crack the German line west of Saint-Lô. Other commanders had done the hard and bloody work of forcing the breach, and Patton was not shy about acknowledging it, though he was considerably less shy about what he intended to do with the opportunity. Where other generals might have consolidated, established supply depots, waited for supporting units to close up, and the situation to clarify, Patton did something that felt almost reckless to conventional military minds. He poured his armored columns through the gap before it had fully closed, and simply ordered them to drive. Drive east, drive south, drive in any direction that put German forces off balance and kept American forces moving. The doctrine he practiced was not written in any manual, in quite the form he applied it. It was instinct elevated to strategy, and for a glorious stretch of weeks, it worked beyond any reasonable expectation. The speed of the Third Army's advance across France stunned observers on both sides. Armored columns covered distances in a single day that would have taken infantry weeks to traverse in the previous war, and the comparison to that earlier conflict was not idle. Many of the men giving and receiving orders had served in it, and the contrast sharpened everything. Towns fell before their defenders could organize. Bridges were seized before demolition charges could be set. German unit after German unit found itself cut off, outflanked, or simply bypassed by an advance that moved faster than the command structure trying to direct a response. The Wehrmacht, which had demonstrated for years that it was among the most tactically sophisticated armies in the world, was struggling to function in conditions where the tempo of battle exceeded its ability to process information and issue coherent orders. Patton was not merely defeating German units, he was collapsing German decision-making itself. To understand what this meant in practical terms, you have to understand what the summer of 1944 looked like for the German forces in France. The Normandy landings had already inflicted catastrophic damage. The attritional fighting in the hedgerows had ground down divisions that could not be easily replaced. The failed assassination attempt against Hitler in July had shattered whatever trust remained between the army's professional officer corps and the political leadership directing it from the east. And now Patton's armored columns were threading through gaps in the line like water finding cracks in a wall, and German commanders were receiving reports of American forces appearing in places they had assumed were safely behind their own positions. The word that appears most often in German accounts of this period is not defeat, it is chaos. The ordinary architecture of military response, the chain of command, the flow of supplies, the rotation of units, all of it was breaking down faster than it could be repaired. Patton watched all of this with the focused intensity of a man who understood. bone deep, that moments like this were rare. He had studied enough military history to know that armies rarely sustained this kind of momentum, that the friction of logistics and exhaustion and enemy adaptation would eventually slow even the most aggressive advance. But he also believed, with a faith that sometimes bordered on the irrational, that you could outrun that friction if you simply refused to acknowledge it, that the will of a commander, imposed fiercely enough on the situation, could extend the window of opportunity beyond what the textbooks said was possible. His staff, many of whom admired him enormously, even while occasionally fearing him, worked without adequate sleep to keep the machine running. His corps commanders drove their units to the edge of what men and vehicles could sustain, and for weeks, the machine kept running. The columns that swept across France in those summer weeks moved through a world of extraordinary variety, rolling agricultural country, river valleys, market towns, ancient forests, and the speed of their passage meant that most soldiers saw it only in fragments, glimpsed through the aperture of a half-track's windscreen, or from the exposed cupola of a tank. The war had a dreamlike quality in those days, at least for the men in the lead elements. Resistance was scattered and often disorganized. Towns welcomed them, or simply stood aside. The roads were clogged with the detritus of German retreat. Abandoned vehicles, discarded equipment, the occasional column of prisoners moving west, with their hands interlaced behind their heads, looking more relieved than anything else. The men at the sharp end of the advance carried a sense that history was moving through them, that they were part of something unprecedented, and in a very real sense they were right. Behind the euphoria, however, certain realities were accumulating in ways that Patton's forward momentum had not yet been forced to reckon with. Every kilometre gained extended the supply lines running back to the Normandy beaches. Every litre of fuel burned was a litre that had to be trucked forward over roads that were themselves increasingly congested and deteriorating. The Red Ball Express, the emergency trucking operation the Americans improvised to keep the advance supplied, was a remarkable achievement, an around-the-clock logistics effort that pushed fuel and ammunition and food eastward at volumes no one had initially planned for. But it was also running at the edge of its capacity, and it could not conjure supplies that did not exist. The mathematics of extended logistics were patient and indifferent, and they would eventually demand their accounting regardless of what any general wished. Patton understood logistics in the abstract, the way a racing driver understands fuel consumption. He knew the principles, he could quote the manuals, but in the heat of the race, he tended to bet that the tank would last one more lap. His faith in forward momentum was not ignorance. It was a calculated gamble, the wager that speed could substitute for supply, that capturing German fuel depots could offset the shortfall from Allied distribution chains, that the enemy's collapse would happen before his own army ran dry. It was a gamble that had paid off repeatedly in the weeks since Cobra. There was therefore every reason, from Patton's perspective, to believe it would continue to pay off. History, he might have argued, rewarded the bold, and everything he had seen in the summer of 1944 seemed to confirm that reading. By late August, the Third Army had swept through a vast arc of French territory and was approaching the frontiers of what had been, only weeks before, Germany's secure western hinterland. The euphoria of liberation was giving way, in the minds of Allied planners, to harder calculations about what came next. The Seine had been crossed. Paris had been liberated, though by other forces, a fact that Patton noted with characteristic displeasure. The broad question facing every Allied commander was whether the momentum of the summer breakout could be carried forward into Germany itself before the Wehrmacht managed to reconstitute a coherent defense. Patton's answer was immediate and unambiguous. Yes, absolutely yes. And the only thing that could prevent it was timidity on the part of the men responsible for keeping him supplied. He was not entirely wrong. The German army in the West was in genuine crisis, and there were moments in late August and early September when Allied intelligence assessments suggested that a sufficiently aggressive push might crack what remained of organized resistance before it could harden into a new defensive line. The window was narrow and closing, but it appeared real. What Patton had not yet fully absorbed was that the same qualities that had made the summer breakout possible, the willingness to outrun logistics, to bypass rather than reduce resistance, to trade security for speed, were about to encounter something that could not be bypassed or outrun. Somewhere to the east, on a bend of the Moselle River, sitting behind walls that had shrugged off sieges before the United States of America existed as a nation, a city was waiting. It had no intention of collapsing on anyone's schedule. It had no interest in the narrative of unstoppable armored advance. Its name was Metz, and it was about to become the place where the summer ended. There is a city in northeastern France that has watched armies come and go for more than 2,000 years. It sits on a bend of the Moselle River, elevated just enough above the surrounding plain that any approaching force must look up at it before they can look into it. The Romans knew it, the Franks knew it, the armies of the Holy Roman Empire knew it, and now, in the late summer of 1944, the men of Patton's Third Army were about to learn what every one of those forces had eventually discovered, that Metz does not give itself away cheaply. The city carried its history not as decoration, but as architecture, not as memory, but as stone. And that stone was about to matter enormously to a modern army that had grown accustomed to speed. To understand why Metz stopped Patton, you must first understand what Metz actually was. Most American soldiers sweeping east through France in those late summer weeks saw it on a map and processed it as a waypoint, a place name between where they were and where they needed to be. The intelligence reaching forward units was incomplete, fragmented, optimistic in the way that intelligence often becomes when an army has been winning consistently for weeks. What the maps did not fully convey was the relationship between the city and its river, between the urban core and the chain of fortified positions that surrounded it like a set of concentric rings. Metz was not simply a city that happened to be defended. It was a defensive system that happened to contain a city at its center. The Moselle River is not a negligible obstacle. Where it bends around the eastern edge of Metz, it presents a water barrier wide enough and fast enough to complicate any crossing under fire. The city itself sits on rising ground on the river's western bank, and its oldest structures occupy the highest terrain, giving defenders natural elevation over any force approaching from the west, the north, or the south. The approaches from the east require crossing the Moselle first, a prospect that any competent defender could make extraordinarily costly. There were bridges, of course, but bridges over defended rivers are not opportunities for attackers. They are killing grounds. The geography of Metz was not incidental to its military value. The geography was the military value. What made Metz something beyond a naturally strong position was what the 19th century had added to that natural strength. Following the Franco-Prussian War of 1870 and 71, Metz had passed into German hands, and the German military mind of that era had immediately recognized what the Romans had recognized centuries before. The city was a fortress opportunity that could not be ignored. Over the following decades, German military engineers had constructed an elaborate system of permanent fortifications, ringing the city at varying distances, forts built from reinforced masonry and later from concrete, designed to present interlocking fields of fire so that any attacker, reducing one position, would simultaneously fall under fire from its neighbors. These were not improvised fieldworks. These were purpose-built military structures intended to resist artillery, infantry assault, and the kind of combined arms attack that the most sophisticated armies of their era could mount. When France reclaimed Metz after the First World War, the forts passed back into French hands, and French military engineers assessed them, modified some of them, and incorporated them into their own defensive thinking. By the time Germany conquered France in 1940 and the city changed hands again, these structures had already survived one world war and several decades of continued engineering attention. They were old, in one sense. In another sense, they were exactly what their builders had intended them to be: durable, interconnected, and genuinely difficult to destroy without enormous effort. The German forces now occupying Metz in the summer of 1944 had inherited this infrastructure, and whatever their other disadvantages, they understood what they were sitting inside. The German garrison that occupied Metz was not, by the standards of the Wehrmacht in its prime, an elite force. It was assembled from the kind of mixed collection of units that the crumbling German front in the West was producing in large numbers by this stage of the war. Officer school students, rear area troops, remnants of shattered divisions pulled back from the disaster in France, and men whose fighting quality was uneven at best. What they lacked in polish and cohesion, however, the fortress system around them could partially compensate for. You did not need to be a first-rate soldier to understand that if you held a prepared position, the attacker had to come to you on ground you already controlled. The forts around Metz created a situation in which even second-rate defenders could inflict first-rate punishment. The layering of these defenses is what made them so punishing in practice. The outermost ring of forts sat far enough from the city center that attackers who succeeded in breaching them would still face another ring of prepared positions before reaching the urban core. Each fort was positioned to cover its neighbors, meaning that a direct attack on any single position would draw fire not just from that position, but from adjacent ones. Engineers and tacticians call this mutual support, and it is among the most effective principles in defensive warfare. It means that an attacker cannot simply concentrate overwhelming force against one point and expect to break through cleanly, because destroying one position only exposes the attacker to fire from positions they have not yet reached. An army pressing into this system would be spending lives and time at every step, not just at the final one. The Moselle River itself, flowing through and around the urban terrain, further complicated any attacker's options by dividing potential axes of advance and limiting the directions from which armored forces could effectively approach. Tanks needed bridges, and bridges were choke points. The river bends, and the islands within it created terrain that channeled attacking forces into predictable corridors that any competent defender would have already prepared to receive. The relationship between the waterway and the fortifications was not coincidental. Centuries of military thinking had placed the forts precisely where the combination of elevated ground and river obstacle created the most advantageous defensive geometry. American planners racing forward in the momentum of late August and early September 1944 were not, in general, focused on the details of 19th century German military engineering. They were focused on maintaining speed, on getting to Germany before the Wehrmacht could recover its balance. In that context, Metz appeared on the operational map as a problem to be quickly solved and moved past, not a problem to be studied carefully before any move was made. The intelligence picture was incomplete, partly because events were moving so quickly that thorough reconnaissance was difficult, and partly because the momentum of recent success created a tendency to minimize obstacles that had not yet been directly tested. When an army has been winning for weeks, Pessimism about the next objective requires a discipline that is difficult to sustain. What made the situation still more complicated was the degree to which the German garrison at Metz was committed to a genuine defense rather than a token resistance. There would be no negotiated withdrawal, no quiet evacuation that left the city open without a fight. The men holding Metz had orders to hold it, and beyond the orders, they had the physical infrastructure that made holding it genuinely possible for longer than any rational assessment of their numbers would suggest. A determined defender inside a prepared fortress complex can stretch out resistance far beyond what his raw manpower figures would predict, because the fortifications themselves multiply the effective combat power of every soldier who stands behind them. The Americans would not simply push through Metz. They would have to take it, meter by meter, fort by fort, in a process that bore no resemblance to the sweeping advance that had brought them there. The contrast between what Patton's army had been doing for the past several weeks and what Metz was about to demand of them could not have been more stark. The breakout from Normandy had been a war of movement, of exploitation, of following crumbling German formations before they could reorganize. It had rewarded boldness, initiative, and the willingness to accept exposed flanks in exchange for speed. Metz offered none of those rewards. Metz offered stone walls, mutually supporting fields of fire, a river that could not be wished away, and defenders who knew that the ground they stood on gave them advantages they could not find anywhere else on the retreating front. What had worked magnificently across the open plains of central France was going to run headlong into something that operated on entirely different rules. And so the stage was set. The Third Army's advance elements were rolling toward a city that looked, from a distance, like one more objective to be checked off and left behind. What they were actually approaching was more than 2,000 years of military geography expressed in stone, concrete, and the grim calculation of a garrison that had no intention of making things easy. The Moselle glittered in the late summer light as if offering passage. It was not. And the forts on the ridgelines above the river, silent and weathered and enormously patient, had been waiting for exactly this kind of moment for decades. The advance had been extraordinary by any measure of modern warfare. From the breakout at Normandy, Patton's Third Army had swept across France at a pace that left staff officers scrambling to keep their maps updated, crossing rivers, bypassing pockets of resistance, and covering ground that the most optimistic Allied planners had allocated weeks to secure. In a matter of days, armored columns were pressing through terrain that had taken years of grinding attrition to cross in the previous war. The roads were choked with vehicles moving east, a mechanical tide pushing toward the borders of Germany itself. Patton rode this momentum like a man who understood, at some instinctive level, that speed was its own form of protection, that an army moving fast enough could outrun the enemy's ability to react, to form coherent lines, to think. His subordinates felt it too, that electric sensation of an enemy coming apart at the seams. Everything pointed forward. Everything, that is, except the fuel gauges. An army of the size and mechanical complexity of the Third required a staggering volume of supplies simply to exist, let alone to fight at the tempo Patton demanded. Every tank, every half-track, every artillery piece, every truck in that vast force consumed fuel in quantities that would have seemed fantastical to a planner sitting in London or Washington. The Allied logistical system, for all its industrial genius, had been designed around a far more measured advance, one that moved in concert with the steady construction of port facilities, the rehabilitation of rail lines, and the careful forward positioning of supply dumps. None of that careful scaffolding had been able to keep pace with what Patton's army was actually doing on the ground. The further east the Third Army drove, the longer the trucks had to travel from the coast to reach the forward units, and the more fuel those trucks consumed, simply making the round trip. It was a problem that fed on itself with every passing kilometer. The Red Ball Express, that remarkable improvised lifeline of convoys running almost continuously across northern France, was already straining under the collective demands of multiple Allied armies racing east. It had been conceived as a temporary measure, a logistical sprint to bridge the gap until proper rail infrastructure could be restored. But as the advance continued, and the gap between the front and the supply bases widened rather than narrowed, the express became not a temporary measure, but the primary artery keeping Allied forces in the field. Drivers worked through the night in both directions, headlights masked to thin slits, pushing trucks beyond their maintenance schedules, burning through their own energy reserves in service of a campaign that would not slow down. The system was heroic in its effort and fragile in its architecture, and it was showing the strain. Patton knew the numbers. His staff briefed him on the fuel situation with regularity, presenting figures that any rational commander would have recognized as a fundamental constraint on operational ambition. The Third Army's forward divisions were operating at times on fuel reserves, measured in hours rather than days, dependent on the next convoy arriving on schedule in order to maintain any forward momentum at all. Ammunition stockpiles at the front were similarly precarious, with the kind of intensive fire support required to crack a defended river crossing or a fortified position consuming shells faster than the supply chain could reliably replace them. Patton heard all of this. He absorbed the reports with the same intensity he brought to everything. And then, characteristically, he treated the logistics problem as something to be overcome by force of will, rather than accepted as a governing reality. This was not mere stubbornness, though stubbornness was surely part of it. Patton operated from a coherent strategic conviction that a hesitant advance gave the enemy time to recover, to construct new defensive lines, to bring up reserves, to transform a collapsing situation into a stabilized one. He had watched, with something approaching contempt, Allied operations stall in Italy and elsewhere when commanders paused to consolidate, only to find the Germans had used the interval to rebuild their defenses into something formidable. In his reading of the campaign so far, every day of forward momentum was worth more than the logistical tidiness of slowing down. The Wehrmacht, he believed, was finished as a coherent fighting force in the West. One more hard push, through the supply crisis and through the Moselle, and Germany itself would lie open. To stop now was, in his mind, to hand the enemy a gift they had not earned on the battlefield. His army commanders and corps commanders listened to these arguments and felt the weight of them. Patton was not a man who invited easy disagreement, and his record of results gave him an authority that went beyond mere rank. When he stood before his commanders and told them that the fuel would come, that the supply situation would be managed, that bold action would solve what caution could not, there was always the uncomfortable possibility that he was simply right again. He had been right about the breakout. He had been right about the pace. The men around him were not fools, but they were also not immune to the force of a personality that had, thus far, seemed to bend circumstances to its will. Still, the unease was real, and it was growing, because the maps and the fuel reports did not lie, and the distance to Germany was not shrinking as fast as it needed to. The Moselle River lay ahead, and beyond it the city of Metz, and beyond Metz the Siegfried Line and the Reich itself. From where Patton stood in his mental map of the campaign, these were obstacles to be overcome in sequence and quickly, the way everything had been overcome in sequence and quickly since the breakout. The river could be crossed. The city could be seized or bypassed, and the drive east could continue without losing the fundamental momentum that had brought the Third Army this far in so little time. What he could not fully account for, or perhaps chose not to fully account for, was that Metz was not simply a city that happened to be in the path of his advance. It was something older and more complicated, built and rebuilt over generations, specifically to resist exactly the kind of force he was preparing to bring against it. The supply crisis had a political dimension too, one that Patton found perhaps the most infuriating of all. Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force was making allocation decisions that distributed fuel and supplies across multiple army groups, advancing on different axes, and Patton believed, with some justification, that his army was not receiving its fair share of what was available. The broad front strategy favored by Eisenhower meant that no single thrust received everything it needed to achieve a decisive result, while multiple thrusts each received enough to advance, but not enough to break through. From Patton's perspective, this was the worst of all possible approaches. It spread limited resources across a wide front and prevented any one army from achieving the kind of concentrated, war-winning breakthrough that he believed was still achievable. He argued for priority. He lobbied, pressured, and occasionally raged. The allocations did not change in the way he wanted. Within the Third Army itself, the effect of the supply shortage was felt most acutely at the divisional level, where commanders had to make daily decisions about what to prioritize with the fuel and shells they actually had on hand. An armored division that could not guarantee fuel for all its tanks had to choose which units moved and which waited, disrupting the coordination that made armored operations effective in the first place. Artillery units that could not guarantee a sustained rate of fire had to plan their support more conservatively, leaving the infantry with less covering fire than doctrine called for. These were not catastrophic failures, but they were cumulative degradations of combat power that translated, on the ground, into assaults that went in without the weight they needed, attacks that achieved initial penetration only to stall when the follow-through was not there. The soldiers doing the fighting felt these effects in ways their commanders did not always fully appreciate from Corps and Army headquarters. Reinforcements, too, were arriving more slowly than the pace of operations demanded. The replacement system was working to push men and materiel forward, but the pipeline had been sized for an advance that was now being conducted faster and over longer distances than the planners had assumed. Units that had taken casualties in the fighting across France were operating below strength, their experienced soldiers replaced by men fresh from training who had not yet learned the particular education that combat teaches and that cannot be taught any other way. This was a quiet erosion of fighting effectiveness that did not show up clearly in the order of battle, but was felt viscerally by the sergeants and lieutenants who led small units into contact with the enemy. And yet, despite all of this, despite the fuel gauges and the ammunition reports, and the arrival of men who had never heard a shot fired in anger, the Third Army kept moving. It was a remarkable thing, sustained by the discipline and professionalism of American soldiers, who had absorbed the aggressive culture of their command and made it their own. The drive east continued, impelled by momentum and by the belief, shared from Patton down to the rifleman, that the war was nearly won, and that stopping now would be a kind of betrayal of everything that had been accomplished since June. When the Moselle appeared on the horizon and the fortress towers of Metz rose above the river valley, there was no serious conversation about turning back or waiting for logistics to catch up. There was only the river and the city and the next objective. What no one yet fully understood was that the city ahead would refuse to behave like all the others that had fallen before it, and that the supply crisis Patton was trying to outrun would arrive at Metz before his army could leave it behind. The first days of September 1944 carried with them the intoxicating scent of victory. Patton's Third Army had torn across France with a speed that stunned even its own commanders, consuming hundreds of kilometers of road in a matter of weeks, and leaving shattered German columns scattered across the summer countryside. Towns had fallen without a fight. Bridges had been seized before defenders could demolish them. The momentum felt almost supernatural, as though the war itself had decided to end, and all that remained was the formality of forward movement. Soldiers who had trained for years for brutal, grinding combat found themselves instead riding atop tanks through cheering French villages, flowers pressed into their hands by liberated civilians. It was the kind of war that made generals believe in their own invincibility. Patton believed more than most. Into this atmosphere of accelerating triumph came the first intelligence reports about Metz. The city sat on the Moselle River like a stone sentinel, ancient and unyielding, and the early reports painted a picture that seemed to confirm the optimism of the moment. German forces in the region appeared disorganized. Supply lines running back toward the Reich were under pressure. The broader Wehrmacht was reeling from catastrophic losses across the entire front, with entire formations dissolving into fugitive clusters of men, trying desperately to find their way home. From a distance, Metz looked like a city waiting to be collected. Another name to add to the growing list of liberations. Another flag to be planted before the army turned its face toward Germany. American commanders approached the problem with confidence that, in hindsight, was the product of weeks of easy success rather than careful analysis. The spearheads of the 12th Corps moved toward Metz in the first week of September, probing the ground ahead with the practiced ease of units that had grown accustomed to light resistance. Lead elements crossed terrain that had seen centuries of European warfare, ground that remembered armies far older than any currently moving across it. The Moselle Valley itself was deceptive, wide in places, narrowed by hills in others, threaded with waterways and low ground that channeled movement in ways that maps suggested but only boots truly confirmed. As American reconnaissance pressed closer to the city, the landscape began to push back in quiet ways. Roads that narrowed, fields of view that shortened, hills that offered commanding positions to anyone willing to defend them. These were not dramatic warnings. They were subtle ones, the kind that experienced soldiers learn to read, and optimistic ones sometimes ignore. Contact came, not with a dramatic confrontation, but with the grinding, confusing friction that characterizes real combat. Small units probing toward the city's outer approaches ran into fire from positions that had no business being as strong as they were. A patrol that expected light screening forces found something harder and more deliberate. Defenders, who had chosen their ground, prepared their positions, and had no intention of moving. The initial American instinct was to treat this as a temporary obstacle, the last gasp of a disorganized garrison that would crumble once proper pressure was applied. Flanking moves were ordered. Artillery was brought up. Officers radioed back assessments that were cautious in their immediate observations, but optimistic about what a day or two of organized effort would accomplish. The city, they assured their superiors, would fall. It did not fall. What became apparent over those first chaotic days of September was that the German defenders had done something that American momentum had not left time to anticipate. They had prepared. The garrison occupying Metz had used the brief window afforded by the American advance to organize its defenses, position its weapons, and decide which ground it would hold and which it would concede. These were not the shattered remnants of a broken army, simply waiting to be swept aside. They were soldiers with orders, with purpose, and with the considerable advantage of fighting from positions they understood intimately. Every approach into the city passed through terrain that the defenders had studied. Every American thrust was channeled by geography toward ground the Germans had chosen to defend. The forts that ringed the city had not yet become the central story. That reckoning would come later, but their influence was already being felt. Artillery fire from positions on the commanding heights around Metz reached American columns at ranges and angles that made suppression difficult. Observers in elevated positions could watch American movement and direct fire with a precision that the attackers found deeply unsettling. Units that had grown accustomed to moving freely, to the open road and the open flank, suddenly found themselves being watched, tracked, and punished for concentrating in the open. The comfortable rhythm of rapid advance broke apart in the approaches to Metz, replaced by the jerky, cautious movement of men, learning that the rules had changed. American commanders adapted quickly in tactical terms. They were professional soldiers, and the basics of dealing with resistance were not foreign to them. But there was a deeper adjustment required, one that took longer to complete. The mental model that had carried the army across France in those intoxicating summer weeks was a model of movement, of exploitation, of using speed to prevent the enemy from organizing. Against Metz, that model did not apply. The enemy had organized before the Americans arrived. The speed of the advance, so lethal to German forces in the open, had arrived at Metz to find that the city had used that same speed as warning time, time to prepare, to reinforce what could be reinforced, and to make ready for exactly the kind of assault that was now being mounted against it. The Americans had outrun their own advantage. Patton himself received the reports from the Moselle with a mixture of irritation and denial that would characterize much of his relationship with this campaign over the coming months. In his understanding of war, boldness solved problems that caution could not. An army that moved fast, that struck hard, that refused to accept limits. Such an army could overwhelm obstacles through will and momentum alone. Metz was, in his early estimation, a problem of nerve rather than a problem of fortification. Push harder, he told his commanders. Commit more force. The defenders would break, as all defenders had broken before them across the long summer of pursuit. His confidence was not irrational. It was the product of genuine experience and genuine success. But it was also the confidence of a man who had not yet been forced to reckon with what Metz actually was. What Metz actually was became clearer with every passing day of that first September week. Probes that should have found gaps found only more resistance. Flanking attempts that should have threatened German lines of withdrawal found instead that the defenders were not thinking about withdrawal at all. There were moments of genuine tactical success, positions taken, ground gained, small victories extracted from a chaotic picture. But none of these successes translated into the collapse that American commanders were expecting and that Patton was demanding. The garrison absorbed the pressure and held. In some places it pushed back, counterattacking with a sharpness that reminded American soldiers that the men across from them had not forgotten how to fight offensively. These were defenders who chose when to defend and when to strike, and that choice belonged to them. The soldiers doing the actual fighting around Metz understood something in those first days that the maps and reports back at headquarters took longer to capture. When you were in the trenches and the shell craters and the muddy approaches to a position that refused to yield, the abstract notion of continued momentum felt very distant. What felt immediate was the weight of fire coming from prepared positions, the difficulty of crossing ground that offered the defender every advantage, and the slowly accumulating evidence that the city in front of you had no intention of making your job easy. These were experienced American infantrymen, men who had crossed the beaches and fought through the hedgerows and chased an enemy across France, and they recognized the particular quality of resistance they were now meeting. It was organized, it was confident, and it was not going anywhere. By the middle of September, the initial phase of optimistic probing had exhausted itself against the reality of Metz's defenses. American units that had hoped to be moving toward Germany were instead consolidating positions in the outer approaches to the city, counting their ammunition, and waiting for orders that reconciled the army's ambitions with its actual situation. The word that began circulating, quietly, cautiously, because it carried implications that nobody wanted to state plainly, was siege. Not the dramatic sieges of history, with catapults and boiling oil, but the modern variant, a grinding, attritional contest of firepower and will, measured not in days, but in weeks and possibly months. For an army built around speed and designed for exploitation, it was an uncomfortable word. For Patton, it was almost an insult, and yet the ground around Metz, littered with the evidence of failed assaults and stubborn defense, was already making the argument on its own terms. The first contact with Metz had lasted only days, but it had already accomplished something significant. It had forced a reckoning between expectation and reality, between what the Third Army had been and what this campaign required it to become. The summer of racing across France had ended, not with a dramatic collision against the German border, but with this slower, harder kind of resistance, rising from stone and earth and the will of men who had decided to hold. Patton would spend weeks refusing to accept what those early September days had already made plain. But armies, like rivers, are ultimately shaped by the terrain they flow through. Metz was terrain of a particular kind, patient, layered, and deeply indifferent to the impatience of the men trying to overcome it. The battle had barely begun, and it was already teaching lessons that nobody in the Third Army had come to learn. By early September of 1944, the men defending Metz were not the broken remnants of a routed army. They were soldiers who had received orders, understood those orders, and intended to carry them out regardless of what was happening around them. The German High Command had designated Metz a fortress city, a Festung, and that designation carried the full weight of ideological obligation and military law. To abandon such a position without authorization was not merely a tactical failure, it was a capital offense. The men holding the Moselle line understood the bargain they had accepted. They would hold, they would bleed the Americans, and they would buy time for the German front to firm up somewhere to the east. Whether any of them believed that front would ever truly stabilize is a question history cannot answer. What is certain is that they fought as though they did. At the center of this defense stood a figure of considerable professional reputation. General Hermann Bulck was not an officer who had risen on political favor or wartime luck. He was a career soldier, methodical and aggressive in equal measure, with combat experience stretching back across years of fighting on the Eastern Front and in the Mediterranean theater. He had commanded armor. He had overseen counterattacks that stabilized collapsing lines, and he had earned the respect of both his peers and his opponents. When Bulck looked at Metz, he did not see a city under threat. He saw a defensive asset of enormous potential, a place where a relatively small number of determined men could impose a disproportionate cost on a far larger attacking force. His task was not to win. His task was to make the Americans pay for every meter of ground until the price became too high to keep paying. The forces Bulck commanded were a mixture of unit types, drawn together by circumstance rather than design. There were elements of regular Wehrmacht infantry, training units pulled prematurely into combat, officer candidates whose formal instruction had been cut short by operational necessity, and the remnants of formations that had been mauled in the fighting further west, and reconstituted with whatever men and equipment were available. On paper, this looked like an improvised garrison. In practice, Balk understood that the physical environment of Metz would compensate for much of what his men lacked in numbers and materiel. A trained soldier in a fortified position with clear fields of fire is worth several times his equivalent in open country, and Metz offered that advantage in abundance. The old stone walls, the sunken roads, the elevated gun positions, the centuries-old masonry that shrugged off small arms fire as though it were rain, all of it worked in his favor. The geography of the city itself was a fundamental part of the defensive equation. The Moselle River did not merely flow past Metz. It bent around portions of the city in a way that channeled any advancing force into predictable approaches. Bridges were controlled, river crossings were covered by fire, and the few routes that an armored column might reasonably use had been registered by German artillery before the Americans even came into range. A commander planning an attack on Metz could not simply pick a direction and push. Every direction had been anticipated. Every natural corridor of advance had been turned into a killing ground. The Americans would discover this, not on a map, but in the field, where the first lesson was always the most expensive. The ring of 19th century forts surrounding the city was the backbone of the entire defensive system, but Balk and his planners had supplemented those forts with a network of prepared positions that connected the larger strongpoints and prevented any attacker from slipping through the gaps between them. Machine gun nests had been dug into hillsides with overlapping arcs of fire. Anti-tank weapons had been positioned to cover any approach that armor might attempt. Observation posts had been established on elevated ground, where German forward observers could watch American movements and call down artillery with the kind of accuracy that only comes from months of careful preparation. The defenders had lived in this landscape long enough to understand it intimately. The attackers were seeing it for the first time, often under fire. One of the fundamental principles Balk applied was the concept of mutual support between positions. No single fortification was expected to hold on its own. Instead, each position was tied into neighboring positions, so that an attack on any one point would immediately draw fire from the flanks and rear. This meant that an American unit that managed to fight its way close to a particular strongpoint would find itself being engaged not just by the defenders directly in front of them, but by other positions they had not yet even identified. Breaking into the defensive perimeter did not mean breaking through it. It often meant finding oneself inside a carefully constructed trap, with fire coming from multiple directions simultaneously. The geometry of the defense was designed to punish success as much as failure. German artillery, inside and around Metz, was another dimension of the problem that American commanders underestimated in the early days of the siege. The guns had been positioned with professional care. Their ammunition supply had been prioritized before the Allied advance cut the city off, and the crews who served them were experienced men who understood how to make every round count. When American forces moved forward, German shells followed them with a consistency that spoke of careful planning rather than hasty improvisation. Road junctions, likely assembly areas, river crossing points, all of them had been pre-registered. The Americans were advancing into a grid that had already been divided and measured, and the German gunners were simply working through that grid methodically. Supply was a constant concern for the defenders, but they had been thorough in their preparations, and they managed their ammunition with a discipline born from years of doing more with less. There was also a psychological dimension to the defense that is easy to overlook when examining the campaign purely as a tactical exercise. The German soldiers holding Metz were fighting inside a city that had been German-administered territory for the better part of a human lifetime. Since the Franco-Prussian War of the early 1870s, Metz had been part of the German world, and many of the men in the garrison had connections to the region that went beyond military duty. For some, this was not a foreign posting. It was a defense of something that felt genuinely theirs. That sense of place, of fighting on ground that carried personal meaning, can sustain a defense long past the point where purely rational calculation would have argued for surrender. Military historians often underestimate what belonging to a particular landscape can do for a soldier's willingness to endure. For the American infantry approaching Metz in the opening days of September, the experience was one of gathering confusion and mounting casualties. Units that had been moving freely across open French countryside for weeks suddenly found themselves in terrain that pushed back. Patrols that went forward to probe the defenses did not always come back. Vehicles that moved too far along certain roads were caught by anti-tank fire that seemed to come from nowhere. The fluid, fast-moving war that had defined the past 2 months dissolved almost overnight into something slow, costly, and deeply disorienting. These were soldiers who had been trained for combined arms maneuver warfare, and they were being asked to conduct something closer to the positional fighting of a previous generation. The adjustment was painful in every sense of the word. American commanders reported back what their men were encountering, and those reports carried a tone of surprise that had not been present since the early days of the Normandy campaign. The defenders were not surrendering under fire. They were not breaking when flanked. They were pulling back when necessary into prepared secondary positions and resuming fire from new angles, trading space for casualties in a controlled, deliberate withdrawal that cost the Americans dearly for every 100 meters gained. Balk's men were fighting not as a garrison making a last stand, but as professionals executing a plan. That distinction mattered enormously. A last stand can sometimes be overwhelmed by sheer weight of force. A professional fighting withdrawal, conducted in prepared terrain, requires patience, methodical application of firepower, and an acceptance of time that Patton was constitutionally incapable of offering. Back at Third Army headquarters, the reports from the front created a discomfort that no one was yet willing to name directly. The campaign was supposed to have moved through Metz by now. Other objectives lay beyond it, other rivers to cross, other lines to break. Every day spent staring at the same fortifications was a day the Germans were using to stabilize the very front that Patton intended to shatter. The irony was not lost on the staff officers who processed the daily casualty returns. The men they were trying to outrun to the east were buying their respite with the blood being shed in the west, and the bill was being paid by German soldiers in old stone forts who had no idea whether anyone was still listening, but they held. Through the heat of early September, through the first probing attacks that revealed the true depth of the defense, through the gradual realization settling over American commanders that this would require something different, through all of it, Balk's garrison held fast, and the clocks on both sides of the Moselle kept running. To understand why Metz resisted so stubbornly, you have to go back further than the summer of 1944. You have to go back more than half a century, to an era when European generals still believed that stone and iron could hold back any army on earth. The forts surrounding Metz were not improvised wartime constructions thrown up in haste against an advancing enemy. They were the product of deliberate, expensive, and extraordinarily sophisticated military engineering, conceived over decades by men who had studied the science of war with the patience and precision of scholars. They had been designed to kill, not randomly, not wastefully, but with a cold geometric logic that turned the terrain itself into a weapon. By the time American soldiers first peered through field glasses at the hills surrounding Metz in September of 1944, they were looking at fortifications that had been refined, expanded, and hardened across generations. What they could see from a distance told them almost nothing about what waited inside. The roots of Metz's defensive architecture stretched back to the aftermath of the Franco-Prussian War, when Germany annexed the region and set about transforming the city into a cornerstone of its western defenses. German military engineers of the late 19th century understood that modern artillery was evolving at a terrifying pace, and so they built accordingly, burying their strong points into hillsides, sheathing them in concrete and earth, connecting them through underground galleries that allowed defenders to move without exposure. The forts were not merely walls and towers. They were integrated systems, each designed to support its neighbors, with overlapping fields of fire, each capable of independent defense if the positions on either side were overrun. By the time the First Great War erupted in 1914, Metz already carried a reputation as one of the most formidable fortified positions in all of Europe. A reputation built not on legend, but on cold engineering fact. That reputation had not diminished in the 30 years since. What made the system so deeply dangerous was its geometry. The forts were not clustered together in a single defensive belt. They were arranged in concentric arcs around the city, staggered at varying distances from the urban core, positioned so that the defeat of one outer position would simply expose an attacker to fire from the next ring inward. An army that smashed through the outermost line of strongpoints would find itself still kilometers from the city, already exhausted and depleted, now facing another layer of fortifications that had been waiting in safety while the outer battle raged. And beyond that second ring lay a third. The architects of this system understood a brutal truth about warfare, that an attacker's strength is consumed by each successive objective, while a defender can rotate, reinforce, and resupply from the protected interior. Metz had been built to weaponize that truth on an industrial scale. Every road, every valley, every natural approach route had been anticipated and covered by at least 2 or 3 separate firing positions. The forts themselves varied considerably in size and design, reflecting decades of evolutionary construction. Some were large, sprawling complexes with multiple artillery casements, deep underground magazines, barracks capable of housing hundreds of soldiers, and water cisterns that could sustain a garrison through a prolonged siege. Others were smaller infantry redoubts, still formidably constructed but designed primarily to provide close-range defensive fire and to serve as hardened communication nodes within the broader network. The connecting tunnels between positions in some sectors ran for considerable distances underground, allowing ammunition and reinforcements to flow between strongpoints without any exposure to artillery bombardment or aerial attack. A besieging army could pound the surface of a fort for hours and accomplish nothing beyond rearranging rubble, while the garrison sheltered in galleries cut deep into the bedrock and waited for the bombardment to end before returning to their weapons. This was not a vulnerability in the design. It was precisely what the designers had intended. The Moselle River complicated everything further. It did not merely flow past the city, it curved around significant portions of the defensive perimeter, creating natural moats that channeled any attacking force into predictable crossing points. Those crossing points were, of course, already covered by the guns of the fortifications. An assault force attempting to cross the Moselle under fire was an assault force operating exactly where the defenders wanted it to be, exposed and slowed by water, mud, and current at the moment of greatest vulnerability. The combination of river obstacles and prepared fortifications created killing grounds that any competent defensive commander could exploit with devastating efficiency. American forces, approaching Metz from multiple directions, would find that almost every avenue of attack led them sooner or later into one of these carefully prepared traps, where movement was restricted, cover was minimal, and the defenders had ranged and registered their weapons long before a single American soldier appeared. American soldiers approaching these positions in September of 1944 had almost no direct experience with this kind of fortification. The campaigns in North Africa, Sicily, and Normandy had produced veterans who understood how to fight across open terrain, how to maneuver around defensive positions, how to use combined arms to suppress and flank an enemy. But reducing a 19th century fort built from reinforced masonry and concrete, with walls several meters thick and guns housed in retractable steel turrets, required a fundamentally different set of skills and equipment. Standard artillery shells that would have demolished a farmhouse or shredded an infantry trench simply bounced off the heaviest fort structures, detonating against their outer surfaces without penetrating to the fighting positions beneath. The Americans were not without powerful weapons, but the weapons they carried had not been optimized for this particular problem. Improvisation would be necessary, and improvisation under fire was always expensive. There was also the question of the terrain surrounding the forts. The German engineers who sited these positions had not merely chosen hills at random. They had selected ground with care, ensuring that the approaches to each fort were as difficult as possible. Steep slopes, soft ground, open fields that offered little cover to an attacking infantry force. The vegetation that had grown up around many of the forts over the decades provided some concealment, but it also masked German defensive positions and wire obstacles that slowed American movement at critical moments. Soldiers who advanced confidently through tree lines would suddenly find themselves in open ground, exposed, with the fort's defenders already tracking their movement through observation slits that had been designed for precisely this purpose. The fort seemed almost alive in their awareness of the surrounding terrain, as though every hollow and hedgerow had been accounted for in the original design, which in many cases it had. The German garrison was not large enough to fully man every position in the entire network simultaneously, and this created some tactical opportunities for American commanders, who studied the layout carefully. But the defenders compensated for their limited numbers through the sheer defensive efficiency of their positions. A small group of resolute soldiers occupying a properly prepared fort could hold off a much larger attacking force for an extended period, simply because the geometry of the position favored the defense so heavily. A garrison of several dozen men in a well-constructed strongpoint could make an attacking force of several hundred pay an enormous price for every meter of advance. Multiply that equation across the dozens of individual positions ringing Metz, and the mathematics of the siege became starkly clear. The Americans would need time, patience, and resources in quantities that Patton had never intended to commit to this city. The interconnected nature of the defensive system also made it resistant to partial solutions. Bypassing a single fort entirely was rarely possible, because the fort's weapons could still reach the roads and terrain that American units needed to use. Leaving a position unreduced meant leaving a source of fire that could disrupt supply lines, interdict movement, and threaten the flanks of any force that pushed deeper. The German commanders inside Metz understood this perfectly, and they positioned their limited forces to exploit it. Every fort that remained in German hands was not simply a defensive position. It was a lever that constrained American freedom of action across a wide area. Neutralizing the fortified ring around Metz was therefore not a preliminary step before the real battle began. It was the battle itself, and it would be fought position by position, fort by fort, with all the patience that Patton most despised. Artillery, which had become the primary instrument of destruction across the Western Front in the First Great War, proved only partially effective against the Metz fortifications. The heaviest American field artillery pieces could damage exposed structures, crater the approaches, and kill soldiers caught in the open. But the deepest and most durable fort structures simply absorbed punishment that would have obliterated any conventional defensive position. Engineers studying the problem began to realize that the only reliable method of reducing the strongest forts was to get soldiers inside them, to force entry through damaged sections, through drainage culverts, through any opening that artillery and demolitions could create, and fight through the interior corridor by corridor. This was slow, frightening, costly work, offering none of the drama of sweeping tank columns and everything of the claustrophobic brutality of close-quarters combat in confined stone passages. For an army built around mobility and firepower at range, it was perhaps the least desirable form of warfare imaginable. Word of the fortifications spread quickly among American units, carried by soldiers who had approached the outer defenses and come back changed by the experience. The forts were not merely obstacles to be overcome by courage and aggression. They were engineering problems of a particular and stubborn kind, problems that demanded specific solutions, applied with specific care. Veterans of earlier fights who had learned to trust their instincts and push forward against German resistance found that those instincts could get a man killed very quickly in the shroud of walls that had been built to withstand a different century's most powerful weapons. Respect for the fortifications grew steadily, even as frustration mounted, and the pressure from above to advance remained constant and unrelenting. Metz had been designed by people who believed absolutely in the power of prepared positions to shape the outcome of wars. Those beliefs had driven every decision about placement, construction, and connectivity across the entire defensive network. Decades later, a different army was discovering that those beliefs had been entirely justified. The city at the center of the ring remained out of reach, not because the Americans lacked courage or firepower, but because the forts surrounding it had been built with a cold, patient genius that time had not diminished. Each position had to be approached with respect, reduced with care, and taken at a cost that accumulated steadily toward a total that no one at the outset had been willing to predict. Chapter 7 Patton's Dilemma. In the first week of September 1944, General George Patton stood at a crossroads that would reshape the entire character of his campaign in Europe. Behind him stretched the wreckage of a German army in collapse, over 600 kilometers of captured territory, and the intoxicating momentum of victories that had seemed to vindicate every audacious decision he had ever made. Before him lay Metz, a medieval fortress city that refused to dissolve into the historical record like so many others. The city's walls and its ring of 19th century forts represented something that Patton's tactics had no easy answer for. Disciplined defenders in prepared positions who had chosen to stand and fight. For the first time since the breakout from Normandy, the irresistible force of American mechanized warfare had encountered an immovable object, and Patton was forced to confront a question he had spent his entire military career avoiding. How does a general obsessed with speed and maneuver respond when speed and maneuver no longer solve the problem? Patton's instinct, hardened by months of success, demanded that he find a way to bypass the obstacle. His Third Army was not composed of soldiers trained for siege warfare, and he understood perfectly well that a protracted assault on a fortified city would require resources he could not spare and time he refused to accept. His supply lines, already stretched to the breaking point, could not sustain both a siege operation in Metz and the continued rapid drive toward the German heartland that occupied his every waking thought. The mathematics of logistics were against him. Fuel consumption alone increased exponentially with every kilometer traveled, and ammunition expenditure in a siege operation would consume reserves that were already critically low. Patton had risen to prominence by refusing to accept conventional military wisdom, by driving his forces forward through impossible circumstances and achieving victories that more cautious commanders had declared impossible. To halt his army now, to dig in for a months-long siege, felt like a betrayal of everything he had accomplished and everything he believed about the nature of modern warfare. Yet the German garrison of Metz showed every sign of intending to extract the maximum price for every meter of ground and every building in the city. The fundamental contradiction of Patton's situation lay in the fact that his doctrine of rapid maneuver warfare, revolutionary and triumphant in open terrain, offered almost nothing of value when confronted by a defended fortress. American military training emphasized breakthrough tactics, deep penetrations into enemy territory, and the exploitation of superior mobility to render enemy positions obsolete. Soldiers were taught to flow around obstacles, to maintain momentum, and to trust that yesterday's victory would create conditions for tomorrow's breakthrough. But Metz was not an obstacle that could be flowed around. It sat directly astride the Moselle River on the most direct axis of advance toward Germany, and any attempt to bypass it would require a lengthy diversion, north or south, that consumed the very time and resources Patton was unwilling to sacrifice. Moreover, leaving a substantial German garrison in his rear would create an unacceptable situation, a constant threat to his supply lines and rear areas that could not be ignored in good conscience. The fortress had to be dealt with, but Patton had no clear answer to the question of how to deal with it in anything less than months. Patton's commanders, particularly his corps commanders and division leaders, began to present him with the cold military reality that he was increasingly reluctant to hear. The assault on Metz would require infantry in overwhelming numbers, sustained artillery bombardment, and the kind of methodical reduction of defensive works that characterized siege warfare from an earlier age. The forts surrounding the city would have to be taken individually, each one reducing the overall strength of the German position in ways that could not be accelerated by boldness or the aggressive application of armor. German defenders, unlike the disorganized and demoralized troops his army had been chasing across France, were settling into prepared positions with fresh supplies of ammunition and clear orders to hold at all costs. Fort Driant, the most prominent strongpoint protecting Metz from the south, bristled with artillery and machine gun positions that American assault troops would have to attack in the face of determined resistance. Every commander who studied the Metz situation reached the same uncomfortable conclusion. This would be neither quick nor clean, and pretending otherwise was merely self-delusion. Yet Patton himself remained convinced that the problem existed not with the fortress, but with the solution being proposed. He believed that if his forces were sufficiently aggressive, sufficiently bold, they could shatter German resistance through superior will and firepower. He looked at the maps and saw an opportunity. The Germans in Metz were isolated, cut off from reinforcement, their situation hopeless in any strategic sense. Surely, he reasoned, a knockout blow, delivered with sufficient force and precision, would collapse their morale and bring about a rapid surrender. This was not the delusion of an ignorant man, but rather the conviction of a general who had seen the impossible made possible through sheer determination repeatedly over the past weeks. His aggressive optimism had been vindicated again and again, and his subordinates, despite their reservations, could point to no recent example of a Patton offensive that had failed due to insufficient boldness. The question became not whether to assault Metz, but how to assault it in a way that minimized the time required while maximizing the chances of a rapid breakthrough. The strategic situation also weighed heavily on Patton's mind, though in ways that reinforced his inclination toward aggressive action rather than cautious deliberation. Intelligence reports suggested that German forces were frantically trying to stabilize a new defensive line much deeper into Germany, a line that would become progressively stronger with each passing week, as German engineers prepared fortifications and units were repositioned to man them. If Patton could break through quickly toward that line while it was still in a state of incomplete preparation, he might achieve a strategic breakthrough that would unravel German defensive plans across the entire front. But if he allowed himself to become bogged down in a months-long siege at Metz, that opportunity would evaporate, and his army would eventually be forced to assault a fully prepared German defensive position that would make Metz look like a minor obstacle by comparison. From this perspective, the siege of Metz was not merely a tactical problem, but a strategic liability that grew worse with every day of delay. The longer American forces tarried in front of Metz, the stronger German positions became throughout the depth of their defensive structure, and the broader strategic implications of Patton's campaign shifted in ways that no amount of audacity could subsequently overcome. The practical question of how to allocate resources presented itself with increasing urgency as September wore on. Patton's planners calculated that a full siege of Metz would require the equivalent of an entire corps worth of infantry and artillery, resources that could instead be pushed forward as part of the spearhead aimed at German territory. Alternatively, a lighter holding force could be left behind to contain Metz, while the main body of the Third Army continued its eastward drive. But this created the problem that the holding force would be insufficient to prevent German breakouts or to quickly exploit any deterioration in the German position. The mathematics of war, it seemed, demanded that Patton make a choice that violated his instincts: either commit fully to the siege and accept the strategic consequences of delay, or push forward and accept the tactical risk of leaving a substantial enemy garrison in his rear. Neither option was particularly palatable, and both carried with them the potential for criticism from higher command if the outcome proved unfavorable. Patton's relationship with his superior command, particularly with General Omar Bradley and General Dwight Eisenhower, also entered into his calculations about Metz, though in complex and somewhat contradictory ways. Eisenhower had broadly supported Patton's rapid drive across France and showed considerable tolerance for the aggressiveness that had characterized Third Army operations. Yet even Eisenhower had expressed growing concerns about overextended supply lines and the wisdom of continuing to push forward when the logistical situation was becoming increasingly precarious. Bradley, Patton's immediate superior, was more temperamentally cautious and more likely to advocate for methodical progress and consolidation of gains, rather than continued headlong advances. If Patton allowed himself to become stalled at Metz, he risked the appearance of losing momentum and inviting second-guessing from superiors, who might conclude that the aggressive strategy had finally overreached itself. Conversely, if he pushed forward and left German forces behind him, he risked being ordered to send reinforcements back to reduce Metz, which would be an even worse waste of resources and would only increase the strategic damage from the original decision to advance beyond the fortress. The supply situation, which had been deteriorating for weeks, suddenly crystallized into an acute crisis that could not be ignored or minimized. The rapid advance across France had depended on captured German supplies, requisitioned French resources, and the ability of American quartermasters to improvise solutions to seemingly impossible problems. Metz, however, stood as the gateway to a region where captured supplies would become progressively less available and where the German army was far more likely to destroy or remove resources rather than leave them for American forces to appropriate. The Moselle River itself represented a significant logistical obstacle that would require bridging operations before supplies could flow freely to the far side. Meanwhile, the supply lines stretching back to the Normandy beaches had become dangerously fragile, dependent on a single railway line that was still under repair and subject to occasional German air attack or sabotage. To continue driving forward with the existing supply crisis would require Patton to accept the reality that his army would be operating on threadbare logistics, sustained only by captured resources and constant improvisation. To commit to a siege, however, would require securing Metz first, which meant that the current supply crisis would have to be endured and sustained throughout a period of multiple weeks or months. The human dimension of the choice was perhaps the one that weighed most heavily on Patton personally, though he expressed it only rarely and with great reluctance. An assault on Metz would require casualties, significant casualties, almost surely, as infantry drove against prepared positions defended by soldiers who had shown no willingness to surrender without extracting a price in American blood. Patton had never been indifferent to casualties, despite his reputation for aggressiveness, and the knowledge that a direct assault would cost the lives of hundreds or thousands of American soldiers created a moral weight that his aggressive instincts could not entirely overcome. Yet the alternative, to delay, to seek a siege solution, to accept the grinding attrition of a protracted investment of the fortress, might ultimately produce even greater casualties by prolonging the war and delaying the final defeat of Germany. This calculation, crude as it might seem, entered into Patton's calculations about strategy and tactics, and the knowledge that either choice would result in American deaths created an almost paralyzing tension in his mind between competing imperatives. By the second week of September, Patton's essential indecision had begun to manifest itself in the orders he issued to his corps commanders. Rather than clearly committing to either an all-out siege or a decisive breakthrough attempt, he issued instructions that attempted to do both simultaneously, asking his forces to attack aggressively, while also attempting to reduce the forts in the surrounding area, and to establish siege positions if initial attacks failed. This approach had the virtue of keeping options open, but it had the corresponding vice of committing resources insufficiently to either strategy and creating confusion about what was actually being attempted. American divisions found themselves launching attacks that were too weak to achieve breakthroughs, but too costly in casualties to be maintained indefinitely if they were merely holding operations. The result was a kind of tactical paralysis disguised as aggressive action, where American soldiers were ordered to attack determined defenders in prepared positions without clear strategic objective beyond the immediate goal of taking ground. The fundamental problem that Patton could not resolve was that medieval fortresses and 19th century military works did not fit into the paradigm of modern warfare as he understood it. In his mind, the future of conflict lay with armored exploitation, with rapid movement, and the collapse of enemy morale before defensive lines could be properly established. But Metz was the past intruding into the future, a monument to older forms of warfare, where prepared defenses and disciplined soldiers could exact costs that no amount of modernity could immediately overcome. Patton had spent his career preparing for swift-moving battles of maneuver, and Metz was demanding that he learn entirely new skills, to accept doctrines he had never trained his army to execute, and to embrace tactics that represented a regression to an earlier, more ponderous form of warfare. The irony was bitter. At the moment when his aggressive strategy seemed on the verge of achieving complete victory, when the entire apparatus of Third Army was optimized for forward momentum and deep penetration, he found himself confronted by a problem that demanded precisely the skills he had spent his career disdaining. The tragic aspect of Patton's dilemma was that neither choice was ultimately wrong in a purely objective sense. A commander who committed to rapid siege operations might have eventually broken through faster than the months of grinding attrition that followed, or he might have simply wasted more resources in fruitless assaults before accepting that patience was required. A commander who pushed forward might have achieved his strategic goals before German defenses solidified, or he might have found himself in an even more precarious situation, with his rear threatened and his supply lines cut. The reality of military command is that perfect information rarely exists, and the choice between different strategies is often a choice between different types of risk and different potentials for future regret. Patton, facing Metz in September 1944, faced a choice that no amount of aggression or boldness could render unambiguous, and it is perhaps the measure of his humanity that he hesitated, that he recognized the weight of the decision, and that he ultimately found himself unable to commit fully to either the path of speed or the path of siege, until circumstances beyond his control forced his hand. The month of September opened with American confidence bordering on euphoria. General Patton's Third Army had raced across France at a pace that defied the laws of military logistics, transforming what should have been a methodical advance into something resembling a cavalry charge. Soldiers spoke in awed tones of the distances covered, the German columns scattered and destroyed, the sense that the war in Europe might end before winter. Yet as the calendar turned to autumn, that momentum encountered something that armor and speed could not bypass. A medieval fortress defended by an enemy who refused to accept his own defeat. Metz loomed ahead like a stone barrier thrown across Patton's path, and the American general discovered that will alone could not dissolve fortifications that had withstood centuries of siege. The city that was meant to fall in days began its transformation into a grinding, bloody trial that would consume the entire month and test the limits of American manpower, supplies, and patience. The first American assaults began in the opening days of September, launched against Metz with the expectation that shock would accomplish what time could not. American commanders believed that a show of overwhelming force, combined with the psychological impact of being surrounded by a mobile army, would persuade the German garrison to surrender or flee. What they encountered instead was resistance rooted in the very geography of the fortress. Metz sat like a medieval crown upon the banks of the Moselle River, surrounded by forts that had been upgraded and integrated into the modern German defensive scheme. The Germans had transformed centuries-old artillery positions into points that could rake entire valleys with interlocking fire. Every ridge, every ravine, every stream bed had been fortified, wired, and registered by German artillery observers, who had weeks to prepare their fields of fire. American units that advanced with confidence found themselves caught in withering crossfire, forced to dig in and call for supporting fire. Their momentum halted as suddenly as if they had struck a wall made of steel. The weather of September 1944 became another combatant in the struggle, one that favored the defender far more than the attacker. Autumn rains fell across the Moselle Valley with increasing frequency, turning the approach to Metz into fields of mud that sucked at the wheels of vehicles and the boots of infantrymen alike. American armor, the tool that had carried Patton's army across France with such devastating speed, became anchored in the mire, unable to maneuver or concentrate for the swift, decisive strokes that had shattered German columns weeks earlier. The wet ground also made digging fortifications a nightmare for attacking infantry, who could not establish proper defensive positions against German counterattacks. American soldiers found themselves fighting in terrain that transformed every field into a bog, where ammunition had to be carried by hand rather than delivered by vehicles, where the cold seeped through uniforms and tents alike, where the romance of rapid advance gave way to the bitter reality of siege. The Wehrmacht defenders, by contrast, occupied fortifications that had been designed by military engineers 2 centuries before, structures that drained water as effectively as they shed bullets, offering shelter and protection that no hastily dug foxhole could match. The German garrison, under General Hermann Balck, was far from demoralized, despite being surrounded and cut off from the rest of Germany. Balck understood his mission clearly: hold Metz long enough to buy time for German forces to stabilize their crumbling front further east. The commander had transformed the fortress into something that resembled a smaller version of Verdun, a meat grinder, where German soldiers could exact maximum casualties from American attackers, while consuming minimum resources that Germany could not replace. The quality of the German troops varied, some being veteran soldiers with years of combat experience, others being drawn from garrison units and fortress troops. Yet all were motivated by discipline, by the knowledge that surrender was not an option, and by an understanding of the terrain that the Americans lacked. German artillery was positioned to exploit the valley approaches, and German engineers had improved and expanded the network of fortifications with patient, methodical work. Every American attack was observed by German forward observers who could call down artillery fire with terrible accuracy. The Germans knew they could not win at Metz, but they could make the cost of winning so high that it would echo through the American command structure for the remainder of the war. The assault on Metz became a chorus of repeated failure, followed by renewed effort. American divisions would attack in early morning, their artillery laying down a barrage that shook the ground and echoed across the valley, soldiers advancing with courage and determination through mud and shell fire. For several hours, small gains might be made, a position captured, a fort approached, a perimeter pushed forward by dozens of meters. Then German counterattacks would roll forward, preceded by artillery that broke American formations, followed by infantry that appeared from fortifications where German troops had sheltered during the bombardment, driving the Americans back to their starting positions. The pattern repeated with grinding monotony throughout September. American casualties mounted into the hundreds and then the thousands, yet the position of German forces scarcely changed. Tanks and self-propelled guns that were committed to capture strongpoints became bogged down in the mud and were picked off by German anti-tank teams. American commanders threw in reinforcements that seemed to vanish into the fortress defenses, producing body counts but no breakthrough. The ammunition crisis that had haunted Patton's supply lines grew steadily worse as September progressed. The American artillery, which had proven devastating in the rapid advance across France, was now consuming shells at rates that the supply system could barely sustain. A single day of heavy bombardment could consume hundreds of tons of ammunition that had to be transported hundreds of kilometers from the ports of Normandy or from hastily established supply depots. Trucks and rail lines that had seemed adequate for supporting a rapidly advancing army proved insufficient for sustaining siege operations that required constant, punishing fire. The shortage of ammunition forced American commanders to ration their artillery, to make choices about which assaults could receive proper fire support and which could not, to engage in a mathematical calculation of targets and explosives that no army wanted to contemplate. Gasoline, which was equally precious, had to be diverted to supply the insatiable demand of vehicles supporting the siege, further straining the logistical apparatus. Patton chafed at the restrictions, but even his aggressive temperament could not overcome the physical reality that his army was consuming supplies faster than the rear echelon could deliver them. American infantry divisions bore the true burden of the Metz stalemate, forced to advance across open ground or through woods, where German defenders held every advantage. The men of these divisions had already marched and fought for weeks, their uniforms worn, their boots worn through, their bodies exhausted from combat and poor sleep and constant alert. Yet they were ordered forward again and again, asked to attack fortifications that had defeated previous assaults, asked to accept casualties for the sake of wearing down defenders who seemed inexhaustible. The leadership at regimental and battalion level did what they could to minimize losses, using artillery support and coordinating assaults with neighboring units. Yet mathematics itself worked against them. German defenders in fortifications could inflict casualties at a ratio of 5 or 10 to 1 against attacking infantry, and September's assaults produced casualty counts that reflected this brutal arithmetic. Men who survived the carnage of the Normandy beachhead or the hedgerow fighting of Normandy found themselves facing conditions, in some ways, even worse. No breakthrough to restore hope, no enemy collapse to justify the sacrifice, merely the prospect of more fighting and more casualties until either American resources or German will was exhausted. The failure of American assaults to achieve meaningful breakthroughs had another consequence beyond the immediate casualty counts. It shattered the mythology that had grown around Patton's command. The American army and public had come to believe that mechanized warfare and aggressive commanders could achieve swift victory, that the old grinding positional warfare of the First World War was obsolete, that bold action could overcome any defensive position. Metz shattered that belief with hammer blows. Here was an American general with superior numbers, superior firepower, and a proven record of success. Yet his army stood locked in the very kind of positional struggle that the 20th century was supposed to have made impossible. German defenders, employing tactics that would have been familiar to commanders from the previous century, were holding their own against modern mechanized forces. The realization seeped through the American command structure and into the ranks that raw firepower and tank divisions could not overcome prepared defenses manned by disciplined soldiers. The cost of that realization, measured in American lives, climbed higher with each passing day. As September deepened, the German garrison began to realize that American patience, though sorely tested, was not yet exhausted. Patton and his superiors had no intention of abandoning the siege, of leaving a German garrison astride their supply lines, of allowing Metz to remain as a threat in their rear. This knowledge, combined with the weekly arrival of American reinforcements that slowly built up the forces surrounding the city, began to create a sinking awareness among German soldiers that time was not their friend. Relief could not come from the outside. German strategic reserves were committed to other sectors, and the Eastern Front was consuming German resources and attention far more completely than the situation at Metz could justify. Balk's men could hold the fortress, could inflict casualties at rates that seemed almost obscene, could maintain their positions through the mud and cold and bombardment, yet they could not expect to be relieved or reinforced. The siege was becoming a form of slow strangulation, a process in which American pressure would increase month by month as supplies arrived and reinforcements built up, while German defensive capacity would slowly weaken as ammunition was expended, as casualties could not be replaced, as the hope of strategic change faded. The psychological dimension of the September stalemate weighed on both armies, though in different ways. American soldiers, accustomed to movement and to the sense that they were driving the enemy before them, found themselves bogged down and bleeding for territory measured in meters rather than kilometers. Officers struggled to maintain morale and discipline among troops who could not understand why this fortress had not already fallen, who questioned the wisdom of expending lives against fortifications that seemed impregnable. The leadership had to speak of patience and of grinding down the enemy, concepts that sat uneasily with the culture of aggressive maneuver that had defined the summer campaign. German soldiers, conversely, found themselves in a position that was slowly becoming hopeless, yet discovered a strange kind of pride in their ability to resist. They were buying time, even if they did not fully understand what that time was purchasing. They were fighting for their homeland, even if it meant holding a fortress surrounded by enemies. The discipline and structure of the Wehrmacht kept them at their posts, kept them attacking when counterattacks were ordered, kept them defending when retreat might have seemed more rational. By the end of September, both sides had learned painful lessons. Patton had learned that not every enemy position could be bypassed or overrun by swift armored thrusts, that some problems required time and attrition to solve. The German command at Metz had learned that their men could hold their fortress, could inflict casualties far in excess of their own numbers, could not ultimately prevent American pressure from slowly, inevitably grinding them down. The month that had begun with hope of swift capitulation was ending with the realization that the siege would extend into autumn and beyond. American strength, though temporarily stretched thin, was resilient and growing stronger each week. German resources, though still formidable in the fortress itself, could not be replenished or reinforced. September's bloody stalemate had revealed the true nature of the campaign. Not a swift maneuver that would end in triumph, but a grinding siege that would test both armies to their limits and extract a price from both before it was finally resolved. In the opening weeks of September, as American forces pressed against Metz's outer defenses, the eyes of commanders fixed upon a particular strongpoint that rose from the landscape south of the city like a monument to an earlier age of warfare. Fort Driant, originally constructed in the 1870s as part of France's network of fortifications designed to defend against German invasion, had been seized and repurposed by the Wehrmacht into one of the most heavily defended positions in the entire Metz defensive complex. The fort sat on elevated terrain that commanded approaches from multiple directions, its concrete casemates buried deep enough to withstand artillery fire, its garrison determined to hold at all costs. American planners recognized that breaking through to Metz proper would require reducing Fort Driant, yet they underestimated both the German commitment to defend it and the terrible geometric advantages that the fort's architecture bestowed upon those who held it. What was supposed to be a swift operation to secure a single strongpoint would become one of the most sanguine engagements of the entire campaign, a grinding battle that would consume American lives at an alarming rate, while the defenders seemed to summon strength from the very stone and earth surrounding them. The American assault began with confidence, born from numerical superiority, and the assumption that modern firepower could overcome any obstacle that the past had constructed. Artillery batteries pounded Fort Driant, with shells fired from the rear, their impacts raising clouds of dust and fragments that obscured the fort's outline against the September sky, yet somehow the structure endured. Infantry companies were committed to assault the fort's position from multiple angles, spreading across open ground that offered no cover, no shelter from the crossfire that poured from the fort's defensive positions. The soldiers of these assault waves were among Patton's best troops, veterans of the rapid breakthrough across France, who had grown accustomed to swift victory and the exhilaration of maneuver warfare. Now they encountered a different enemy entirely, not a retreating force broken by superior speed and firepower, but a garrison entrenched in prepared positions, resolved to hold ground no matter what sacrifice it required. The contrast between expectation and reality struck with force as the first waves of American soldiers reached the fort's perimeter and found themselves caught in interlocking machine gun fire that seemed to come from everywhere at once, emanating from loopholes and casemates that no artillery barrage had managed to silence. The defenders of Fort Driant, numbering roughly 350 men under the command of German officers, who understood that their survival depended upon making the cost of the fort's capture prohibitive, were dug in with the thoroughness that only months of preparation could provide. They had registered their machine guns on the approaches, calculating ranges with precision so that every open space between the fort's walls and the surrounding terrain became a zone of death where attackers could neither advance nor retreat without coming under fire. The Germans had moved additional ammunition into the fort, stacked reserves of grenades and rifle rounds, and created interior fallback positions that would allow them to trade space for time, withdrawing from one defensive line to another and exacting maximum cost at each stage. German engineers had laid mines and wire obstacles that further restricted American movement, forcing attacking troops to bunch up at breaches in the perimeter, where German defenders concentrated their fire with devastating effect. The fort itself, with its massive concrete walls and interconnected underground passages, provided protection that made German casualties notably light despite the numerical disparity facing them, while American soldiers attacking in the open suffered grievously. The garrison included a core of fanatical SS troops alongside Wehrmacht regulars, men who viewed surrender not as an option, but as a form of betrayal, and this steely determination infused the entire defense with a cohesion and purpose that undermined American attempts to break the garrison's will through attrition. The first assault waves, launched in the opening days of the siege, were repelled with casualties that shocked American command, who had expected Fort Driant to fall within hours, rather than endure as a contested strongpoint for weeks. Groups of American soldiers managed to breach the fort's outer wall and penetrate into its interior courtyard, fighting room to room through fortified spaces designed specifically to favor the defenders. But these penetrations were isolated, unsupported by sufficient reinforcement, and the Germans responded with ferocious counterattacks that drove Americans back out of the fort's interior and onto the exposed slopes surrounding it. The Americans would reorganize, bring up more troops, attempt another assault from a different direction, only to encounter the same grinding resistance, the same interlocking fire that made progress measured in meters at the cost of dozens of casualties. Day after day, assault followed assault, with American artillery firing thousands upon thousands of rounds that churned the earth around Fort Driant into a lunar world of craters and rubble. Yet the German defenders remained, seemingly impossibly ensconced within their concrete stronghold. The psychological strain on American troops mounted, as attacks succeeded in gaining temporary footholds only to result in withdrawal when German counterattacks and the sheer weight of defensive fire made holding the gained ground impossible without reinforcements that never seemed to arrive in sufficient numbers. The terrain around Fort Driant became a graveyard of American ambition, where stretchers bearing wounded men moved constantly to the rear, and the names of the dead were recorded in company rolls that grew longer with each passing day. Officers found themselves in the agonizing position of ordering men to attack positions they knew would cost lives without producing any decisive breakthrough, a moral calculus that wore upon the conscience of every commanding officer involved in the siege. The American soldiers themselves, accustomed to rapid success and the forward momentum that Patton's command had maintained since breaking out from Normandy, began to understand that this war would not end quickly or cleanly, that prepared defenses could exact a price that no amount of firepower alone could avoid. Medics worked ceaselessly, moving between wounded men, applying tourniquets and bandages, while shells continued to fall and machine gun fire snapped overhead, their own casualties mounting as they ventured into zones that should have been secured but remained contested. The contrast between the promise of swift victory that had animated American assumptions in early September and the grinding, costly siege operations that became their reality created a cognitive dissonance that affected morale throughout the American lines. Letters home from enlisted men began to reflect growing uncertainty about the war's course, a dawning awareness that Germany's defense would not collapse under the weight of American assault alone, that the work of victory would be longer and costlier than anyone in the early days of September had imagined. German resilience at Fort Driant drew partly from the physical strength of the position itself, but it drew equally from the fact that the garrison understood they were trading space and time for something Germany desperately needed: respite for forces being reorganized east of the Moselle, breathing room for German commanders to stabilize a front that had collapsed in the weeks immediately following Normandy. The defenders knew that every day Fort Driant remained in German hands was a day that American forces could not fully invest in pushing toward the Rhine, a day that German reserves might be shifted to contain American advances elsewhere. This knowledge that their sacrifice was not merely local but contributed to a broader strategic picture infused the garrison with a sense of purpose that pure self-preservation might not have provided. German officers visited the fort under cover of darkness, bringing intelligence that the American supply lines remained stretched dangerously thin, that reinforcements could not arrive at Metz as quickly as the American assault seemed to expect. The defenders heard these reports and took comfort in them, believing that if they could hold long enough, American momentum would falter, that attrition might work in their favor, despite the numerical imbalance. This strategic understanding, combined with the fort's inherent defensive strength, made Fort Driant a far harder nut to crack than American planners had anticipated, a reality that became more apparent with each passing day of costly assault. The assault on Fort Driant continued through September and into October, a campaign within the broader campaign that consumed resources and lives in a way that exemplified the grinding character that the entire Metz operation would take on. American commander decided on multiple occasions to withdraw assault troops from the fort and commit them to operations elsewhere around Metz's perimeter, reasoning that it might be more efficient to reduce the outer defenses and starve Fort Driant into surrender rather than continue to attack its prepared positions frontally. Yet the fort could not simply be left unconquered. Its defenders could still inflict casualties on American troops operating nearby, could still coordinate with German defenders elsewhere around Metz, could still serve as a rallying point for German morale. So the assaults continued, wave after wave, with American companies taking turns trying to break through, each rotation bringing fresh troops who had to relearn the harsh lessons that their predecessors had purchased with blood. Artillery support was brought forward, guns positioned closer to Fort Driant to provide more effective fire support to the assaulting infantry, and the scale of the bombardment increased as American command committed more resources to the problem. Yet still the fort held, its defenders sheltering in their concrete bunkers, while shells rained down upon the landscape, emerging from shelter to man their positions whenever American assault waves approached, repelling them with machine gun and rifle fire that never seemed to diminish in volume or effectiveness. The final assault on Fort Driant came in late September, after weeks of grinding attrition had worn down both the attacking force and the defenders. Though the Americans, with access to reinforcements and supplies, held the strategic advantage in any war of attrition, despite the tactical difficulties posed by the fort's prepared defenses. American forces by this point had learned lessons about siege warfare through painful experience, bringing up additional supporting weapons, improving coordination between artillery and infantry, establishing clearer command relationships among the various units involved in the assault. They brought forward flamethrowers to burn out German positions in the fort's casemates, a tactic that produced horrifying results, but also greater effectiveness than frontal assaults had achieved. They maneuvered for positions that would allow enfilading fire into German strongpoints, using the fort's own geometry against its defenders by finding angles of approach that exposed defenders to fire from multiple directions. They brought up more troops, more ammunition, more supporting fire, and when the final assault came, it came with a weight of resources that the German garrison, depleted by casualties and exhaustion, could not repel. Even then, German defenders fought in the fort's interior passages and compartments, continuing to resist even as the outer defenses crumbled, conducting a fighting withdrawal that cost more American lives, even in the moment of ultimate defeat. The fall of Fort Driant, when it finally came, represented a hollow American triumph that had consumed far more resources and lives than the initial assault plans had suggested would be necessary. The fort's defenders withdrew in organized fashion, disengaging from their positions under cover of darkness and withdrawing into the broader defensive complex around Metz, their sacrifice having bought time for German forces elsewhere to consolidate and organize their defenses. American soldiers who occupied the captured fort found the scale of the German defense installations almost incomprehensible. The depth of the bunker complex, the layers of obstacles and defensive positions that the Germans had constructed, suggesting that even the costly assault they had endured had only overcome the fort's outer shell, not the full extent of its prepared defensive system. The victory gave American forces a foothold on the southern approach to Metz, but it came at a price in casualties that vindicated the Germans' decision to hold the position, proving that prepared defenses in the hands of determined troops could inflict costs on attackers that no amount of numerical superiority could entirely overcome. For Patton, Fort Driant represented a harsh lesson in the limitations of maneuver warfare and the reality that some objectives could not be bypassed or outflanked, but must be reduced through grinding siege operations that violated every principle of mobile warfare he had mastered. For the American soldiers who had assaulted the fort, Fort Driant became a symbol of the war's transformation from the swift, mobile campaigns that had characterized the breakout from Normandy into something far more costly, far more attritional, and far less amenable to the rapid maneuvers that had produced such stunning victories only weeks earlier. The autumn of 1944 arrived at Metz like an unwelcome guest, transforming the muddy terrain around the fortress city into a world of growing desolation. Rain fell with increasing frequency and intensity as September bled into October, turning the fields and approaches to the German stronghold into a quagmire that bogged down American vehicles and left infantrymen exhausted before they even reached the defensive positions. The weather, which Patton's planners had largely discounted in their calculations of rapid victory, became as formidable an enemy as the German garrison itself. The temperatures began their slow descent toward winter, and soldiers on both sides found themselves contending not only with enemy fire and artillery, but with the grinding misery of cold, wet, and perpetual mud. Supply trucks that had struggled to reach the front line before now faced impassable roads that turned combat advances into exercises in futility. Yet it was precisely during this period, as the campaign threatened to devolve into pure attrition, that the strategic situation began to shift in the Americans' favor, in ways that no single dramatic assault could have achieved. The arrival of American reinforcements marked the turning point that Patton's ambition and impatience could not have secured alone. Throughout September, the Third Army had operated with the assumption that speed could compensate for insufficient manpower, that audacity could overcome the stubborn reality of entrenched defense. But by early October, replacement infantry divisions began arriving at the front, men drawn from training camps and rear area postings, who now took their places in the grinding assaults on Metz's forts and fortified positions. These reinforcements, modest though they seemed when set against the scale of combat, nonetheless represented a crucial shift in the balance of forces around the beleaguered city. American commanders could now commit fresh troops to assault positions without completely exhausting the divisions that had borne the campaign's heaviest burden since September. The psychological effect on the tired soldiers already in the line was immediate and tangible, a sense that the endless ordeal might eventually reach some conclusion. For the first time since the initial contact with Metz's defenses, American forces possessed sufficient strength to sustain both the attacks on the city's remaining strongpoints and the broader containment operations that kept the German garrison from breaking out. Behind the fighting line, meanwhile, American logistics personnel and supply officers worked with growing urgency to stabilize a system that had been stretched to the breaking point by Patton's relentless advance across France. The long supply chains that stretched back across hundreds of kilometers to the Normandy beachhead had become so attenuated by summer's end that Patton's forces operated in a state of perpetual shortage, rationing fuel and ammunition in ways that restricted tactical freedom. Truck convoys on extended runs suffered from breakdowns and accidents, and the sheer demand for supplies outpaced the capacity of the transportation network to deliver them. But as October progressed, American logisticians implemented new routing procedures, expanded transport capacity, and established additional supply dumps closer to the front lines around Metz. Railways, partially repaired and operating under American control, began to move increasing volumes of material forward. The port of Antwerp, captured in September but not yet fully operational, gradually began to serve as an alternative source of supplies, reducing dependence on the exhausted truck routes that had been the lifeline of Patton's advance. By mid-October, the supply situation had improved measurably, not to the point where Patton could launch the renewed offensive thrusts he craved, but enough to sustain the siege operations that had become the campaign's reality. The German defenders of Metz, for their part, had no such luxury of reinforcement or supply improvement. General Hermann Bulk's garrison, though still numbering in the tens of thousands, faced a slowly tightening noose as American forces consolidated their positions and American supply lines stabilized. The Germans could not be reinforced from the east because no German forces were available for such a task. The Wehrmacht's entire eastern frontier consumed every available soldier. They could not hope for relief because the German army's strategic position in France continued to deteriorate, with collapsing fronts in Alsace and along the Rhine approaches. The garrison received what supplies it could, but these grew scarcer with each passing week as American artillery cut the already tenuous supply routes that led back into Germany. Morale within the garrison remained higher than one might expect under such circumstances, sustained by discipline, the fortress mentality that comes with defending a strong position, and the determination that comes from knowing that surrender means captivity. Yet even the most resolute soldiers understood the mathematical reality. They were being ground down, and no reinforcements would arrive to restore them. The defensive capacity that Bulk's forces could bring to bear in November would be measurably less than what they had commanded in September, simply because attrition was a mathematical equation, and the mathematics favored the besiegers. The assault on Metz's fortifications continued throughout October with a grim regularity that lacked the desperate intensity of September's fighting. American commanders, now with reinforcements at hand and supply lines functioning more reliably, adopted a methodical approach to reducing the German strongpoints that ringed the city. Each fort and fortified position became the object of deliberate planning and coordinated assault, preceded by artillery bombardment and supported by engineer units tasked with breaching obstacles and reducing fortifications. The forts fell one by one, some after days of fighting, others after weeks of attrition that wore down defenders until surrender or withdrawal became inevitable. Fort Driant, which had consumed American blood and resources in spectacular fashion during September, finally fell as surrounding positions were reduced, and the fort's garrison found itself cut off and under assault from multiple directions. Other strongpoints, Forts Jeanne d'Arc, Renier, and Saint-Blaise, required similarly painstaking reduction, each demanding coordinated operations involving infantry, armor support, and engineer expertise. The tempo of operations lacked the chaotic energy of earlier assaults. Instead, the campaign took on the character of a grinding, methodical destruction of an enemy position by an attacker that now possessed time, resources, and reinforcements sufficient to accept no shortcuts. Yet even as American operational capacity improved, the reality of siege warfare continued to exact its toll on the attacking forces. The soldiers who took part in October's assaults on Metz's forts did not enjoy the comfort of sufficient strength that would allow them to break resistance quickly or to spare themselves the worst of the defensive firepower arrayed against them. German defenders, though increasingly isolated and aware that their position was becoming hopeless, nonetheless fought with the intensity of men defending their homeland. Every fort had to be stormed, every strong point reduced through direct assault or siege. The American casualties continued to accumulate, not in the hundreds on dramatic single days, but in the steady tens and dozens that added up across the weeks. The weather made everything worse. The cold and mud of October sapped the strength of attackers as surely as any German defensive fire. Soldiers dug in on the muddy slopes leading to fortified positions found themselves unable to dig deeply, the ground too waterlogged to provide proper cover, and the constant dampness created conditions favorable to disease and foot rot as much as to combat. The campaign had become a form of attrition that was beginning to wear on American morale as well, despite the promise of eventual victory that reinforcements and improved supply lines offered. The tactical problem that Metz represented did not disappear simply because American reinforcements had arrived and supply lines had stabilized. A fortress city surrounded by elaborate defensive positions required either a breakthrough of the surrounding defenses or the reduction of each strongpoint until German defenders had no option but surrender or destruction. The Second World War had produced precious little experience with siege warfare. Modern armies trained and equipped for mobile operations suddenly found themselves engaged in operations that belonged to an earlier century, operations that tested doctrine and improvisation equally. American commanders had to adapt their tactics, learning through trial and bloody error how to combine armor, infantry, and artillery support in assaults on fortified positions that could not simply be bypassed. Engineers had to learn how to breach walls and breach obstacles under fire, a task for which their training had been insufficient. Infantry had to assault fortified positions in ways that resembled not the maneuver warfare they had trained for, but the attritional assaults of the First World War. The American Army, equipped and organized for the kind of mobile warfare that had characterized the Normandy breakout and the sweep across France, discovered that it could apply these capabilities to siege warfare only by modifying and adapting doctrine in real time, paying for lessons in casualties and lost time. The reduction of Metz's defensive system proceeded through October, with sufficient momentum to suggest that the German garrison's days were numbered, even as the pace of operations remained far slower than Patton or his superiors would have preferred. Each week brought news of another fort captured, another strongpoint eliminated, another section of the German perimeter contracted. The maps in American command posts showed the progressive reduction of German-held territory, a satisfying visual representation of progress toward an objective that had seemed to slip further away during September's bloody stalemate. The German garrison's ability to conduct counterattacks diminished perceptibly as the month progressed, as ammunition became scarcer and troop losses accumulated beyond the point where replacement was possible. Balka's defensive line, which had seemed so formidable when the campaign began, had become a series of disconnected strongpoints, connected only by thin threads of supply and communication, increasingly vulnerable to the attrition that American firepower and numbers could bring to bear. The strategic picture beyond Metz continued to evolve in ways that affected the campaign's character and pace. German resistance on other fronts remained fierce, particularly in the approaches to Alsace and along the Rhine, where the Wehrmacht had pulled together enough strength to conduct local counterattacks that achieved surprising success. The German Ardennes offensive, launched in December, was already being planned and prepared in early October, though American commanders did not yet understand the scale or imminence of the attack being prepared against them. These broader strategic developments meant that American High Command could not commit unlimited resources to the Metz campaign. Divisions and reinforcements had to be carefully allocated to cover the entire European front, and the commitment of too much strength to one siege might leave other sectors vulnerably held. Nonetheless, the gradual arrival of reinforcements to the Third Army's area of operations allowed Patton to maintain pressure on Metz, while also building up reserves that might be necessary if German counterattacks materialized elsewhere. The campaign thus continued at a grinding pace that neither satisfied Patton's desire for rapid maneuver nor the German defenders' hope for the miracle of relief or breakthrough that might transform the fortress city's desperate situation. By late October, as the leaves fell and the weather turned consistently colder, the transformation of Metz from an objective that seemed achievable through swift maneuver into a siege position showing signs of imminent collapse had become unmistakable. The German garrison, weakened by attrition and increasingly isolated, maintained discipline and continued to resist with skill, but the strategic inevitability of eventual American victory had become apparent to anyone with eyes to see. Patton's frustration with the pace of operations remained evident in his communications with higher command. His conviction undiminished that speed and audacity could have achieved in weeks what was taking months. Yet even Patton had come to acknowledge, if only to himself, that Metz would not be taken by maneuver warfare or by some brilliant stroke of tactical genius, but rather through the slow, grinding reduction of defensive positions that characterize siege warfare. The arrival of reinforcements and the stabilization of supply lines had transformed the campaign from one in which American forces faced potential failure into one in which German defeat was merely a matter of time. The question that remained was not whether Metz would fall, but when, and what price in casualties and time the final victory would exact from both attacker and defender before the city's long struggle finally ended and the American advance toward Germany could resume. Through the autumn months of 1944, the character of the fighting around Metz transformed entirely. The rapid maneuver warfare that had defined Patton's advance across France gave way to something far grimmer, a methodical, grinding siege that would consume resources and lives in quantities that neither side had anticipated. What had begun in early September as an expected swift reduction of an isolated fortress city had become instead a war of attrition played out across a world of fortified positions, muddy approaches, and determined defenders who refused to concede. By late October, the true nature of the campaign had become impossible to deny, even to the most optimistic commanders. This was no longer a mobile operation, but a siege, and a siege in the autumn and early winter conditions of eastern France promised to be among the most grueling engagements of the entire European campaign. The American approach to reducing Metz evolved necessarily from ambition to pragmatism. The German garrison, under General Hermann Balck's command, had proven far more resilient than initial assessments had suggested. The fortress complex that surrounded the city, those concentric rings of 19th-century forts reinforced with modern defensive improvements, could not be rushed or bypassed. American commanders gradually accepted that Metz would have to be reduced methodically, fort by fort, strongpoint by strongpoint, in a campaign that resembled the trench warfare of the First World War more than the armored breakthroughs of 1944. Infantry units that had grown accustomed to riding in trucks and following tank columns now found themselves dismounting and advancing on foot through prepared defensive positions. The lessons of mobile warfare seemed suddenly irrelevant in the face of skillfully sited machine gun nests, artillery positions integrated into fortress architecture, and defenders who possessed both the means and the determination to make every kilometer cost in American blood. The German defenders, meanwhile, understood their position with crystalline clarity. They could not hope to defeat the American Third Army, but they could extract a price from it that would echo far beyond the walls of Metz itself. General Balck and his officers recognized that their primary mission was not to hold the city forever, but to hold it long enough for German forces to stabilize their crumbling eastern front, long enough to conduct the deliberate withdrawal toward more defensible positions inside Germany itself, long enough perhaps for some strategic turning point that senior German command hinted at, but could not guarantee. This defensive philosophy meant that the German garrison fought with a particular kind of intensity born from clarity of purpose. They were not defending for victory, but for time, and time meant accepting casualties that other commanders might have considered prohibitive. It meant counter-attacking when circumstances allowed, holding strong points to the last man when they could not be relieved, and maintaining discipline in a deteriorating situation through sheer force of military culture and the steadfast leadership of experienced officers. The terrain around Metz became as much an enemy to the Americans as the German defenders themselves. October rains had turned the approaches to the city into morasses of mud and standing water, making movement of supplies and equipment agonizingly slow. The Moselle River, which ran through the city and around its northern and eastern approaches, became a barrier that American engineers had to overcome repeatedly as German defenders contested every crossing. The undulating ground surrounding the city, dotted with small villages and copses of woodland, provided ideal defensive terrain where German troops could establish overlapping fields of fire and retreat to new positions when American forces managed to advance. Weather conditions deteriorated steadily as autumn progressed toward winter, with morning fog that obscured observation and movement, afternoon rain that made every position damp and miserable, and temperatures that dropped toward freezing as darkness fell. Supply vehicles that had already been strained to their breaking point by the length of the advance from Normandy now struggled to navigate muddy roads and deliver ammunition, food, and fuel to forward positions. The romance of rapid maneuver had given way to the medieval reality of trench warfare and siege conditions. American commanders, at various levels, responded to this grinding situation with tactics ranging from frontal assaults to elaborate attempts at encirclement and starvation. Some units, particularly those from divisions that had sustained heavy casualties already, attempted frontal attacks on German positions, with results that were predictably catastrophic. Machine gun fire from positions sheltered in fort walls or earthen bunkers could cut down attacking infantrymen at ranges where return fire was largely ineffective. Artillery bombardments, though effective at destroying fortifications and causing German casualties, often simply forced defenders deeper into underground positions from which they could continue to resist. American commanders learned slowly that Metz could not be taken by a single dramatic breakthrough, but only through the methodical reduction of dozens of strongpoints, each of which had to be surrounded, suppressed, and ultimately assaulted when German defenders could no longer hold against the accumulated weight of American firepower and numbers. This process consumed ammunition at rates that strained supply lines, consumed infantry replacements at rates that forced divisions to consolidate and reorganize, and consumed time at rates that frustrated Patton's command philosophy, while simultaneously vindicating the German decision to hold the city at any cost. The assault on individual forts and strongpoints around Metz became the dominant tactical pattern of late October and November. Each fortress presented a unique problem to American commanders. Some could be approached from certain directions, but were protected on other sides by geography or interlocking fire from neighboring positions. Others were simply too strong to assault directly and had to be bypassed, while smaller units contained the German defenders until ammunition ran low and surrender became inevitable. American infantry learned the grueling business of siege warfare, the careful advance from one piece of cover to the next, the desperate scramble across open ground under fire, the brutal hand-to-hand fighting when assaulting positions at close range, and the grim process of clearing fortified rooms and bunkers of determined defenders who would rather die than surrender. Tank crews, which had grown accustomed to operating in open terrain, where their mobility and firepower provided overwhelming advantages, now found their vehicles of limited value in a siege. Tanks could be used to support infantry assaults or to provide covering fire for advancing troops, but they were vulnerable to anti-tank guns positioned in fortress walls or to infantry with close-range anti-tank weapons, and the rough, muddy terrain around Metz limited the effective deployment of armored vehicles. German morale during this extended siege demonstrated the remarkable capacity of disciplined soldiers to endure grinding conditions when they understand their role clearly. The German garrison at Metz knew that they could not win, could not be relieved, could expect no reinforcements. Yet they fought on with a stubbornness that American commanders grudgingly respected. The German soldiers who held the line around Metz were a mixture of regular Wehrmacht troops, some Waffen-SS units, and even Nazi Party officials, pressed into service as the casualty rolls mounted. They shared a recognition that their sacrifice was serving a purpose, however desperate, and that giving ground simply meant retreating toward the same inevitable conclusion at a different location. This was the peculiar psychology of a defeated army fighting a rearguard action. The cause was lost, but the duty was clear. American soldiers, by contrast, often struggled to understand why they were being asked to assault prepared positions and accept casualties in pursuit of a city that had no obvious strategic importance beyond its position on the map and its symbolic value as part of the drive toward Germany. As October turned to November, the concentration of American forces around Metz increased steadily. Reinforcements arrived from other sectors or from divisions being pulled back from other parts of the front, and American commanders gradually accumulated the numerical preponderance necessary to apply overwhelming pressure on the German defenders. New ammunition supplies, though never abundant enough to eliminate the constraints imposed by long supply lines, allowed for more aggressive artillery programs that could hammer German positions for hours or days at a stretch. American engineers worked to improve approaches to German strongpoints, clearing mines, establishing covered routes for infantry advance, and creating positions from which supporting fires could be brought to bear more effectively. The German defenders found their ammunition supplies increasingly constrained as their lines of communication back into Germany came under increasing pressure from American air power and advancing American forces at other points along the front. Wounded German soldiers could not be evacuated, and their presence in fortified positions tied up other soldiers who had to provide medical care. The slow erosion of German defensive capability proceeded inexorably, but the process consumed weeks of grinding effort and cost American lives at a rate that seemed disproportionate to the tactical significance of the objective. The human dimension of this grueling siege became increasingly apparent as November progressed. American soldiers who had entered this campaign believing that the war in Europe was nearly over now found themselves engaged in brutal trench warfare against an enemy that refused to acknowledge defeat. Letters home from American soldiers serving in the Metz sector began to reflect a grimmer understanding of what combat meant at close range and in prepared positions. Men who had survived the hedgerows of Normandy, the rapid advances across France, and months of continuous operations now faced the prospect of going forward against fortified positions where the outcome was never in doubt, but the cost remained terrifyingly uncertain. German soldiers, for their part, endured similar grinding conditions, with the additional burden of knowing that they were ultimately fighting for a cause that was already lost, and that the end, whenever it came, would mean either death in combat or captivity. The front around Metz, visible from much of the surrounding countryside, became a symbol of the war's transformation from the swift, mechanized maneuver that had characterized the summer of 1944 into something far more primitive, brutal, and attritional. The role of American artillery in the siege became increasingly central as October and November wore on. Gun positions multiplied around Metz, and the coordination of artillery fire became more sophisticated and destructive. American gunners learned to time their fire to support specific infantry assaults, to maintain continuous bombardments designed to suppress German defenders and prevent their counterattacks, and to concentrate firepower on specific strongpoints identified by observers and intelligence personnel as particularly significant threats. The constant thunder of American guns became the background noise of life in the Metz sector, a sound so continuous and pervasive that soldiers who spent weeks in that area often reported that the silence following a lull in the bombardment seemed somehow more ominous than the explosions themselves. German artillery responded when ammunition allowed, but American firepower gradually overwhelmed German gun positions and forced German batteries to relocate or fall silent. The balance of attrition gradually tilted in the direction of the Americans, not because individual engagements favored them necessarily, but because the Americans possessed the resources to sustain the siege indefinitely, while the Germans did not. Supply became the hidden battleground that ultimately determined the outcome of the siege. American supply lines, though stretched thin and subject to constant difficulty, ultimately proved capable of sustaining an extended campaign around Metz. Trucks and rail lines carried ammunition, food, medical supplies, and replacement soldiers to American positions in quantities that were often inadequate, but never completely insufficient. American commanders, frustrated though they were by supply constraints, could nonetheless continue to sustain operations indefinitely, because American industry and logistics systems, despite their strain, possessed the capacity to support extended operations. German supply systems, by contrast, operated under conditions of increasing duress. As American forces advanced and German territory contracted, supply lines became shorter, but also became more exposed to American air attack and artillery fire. The German garrison at Metz, cut off from the German heartland and unable to establish secure supply routes, faced the prospect of diminishing ammunition, food, and medical supplies. This fundamental disparity in logistical capacity meant that the siege, however grinding and costly in American casualties, would eventually result in American victory, as the German defenders simply ran out of the material means to continue resisting. The grinding siege of Metz, through October and into November, embodied the transition that would characterize the remainder of the European campaign. The swift mobile warfare of the summer, the rapid advances across France, and the promise of quick victory that had seemed so attainable in early September, all gave way to a different kind of war, slower, more methodical, more attritional, and more costly, in human terms, than the mechanized breakthroughs that had preceded it. American forces learned the bitter lessons of siege warfare and the stubborn resistance of disciplined defenders willing to fight to the last for objectives that no longer held strategic significance. German forces demonstrated the capacity of military culture and leadership to sustain discipline and fighting capacity in the face of inevitable defeat. And across the landscape around Metz, soldiers on both sides endured conditions that tested their physical and psychological limits, while contributing to an outcome that neither side could prevent or significantly alter. The fortress and the surrounding campaign became a microcosm of the war's final phase, a preview of the grinding positional struggle that would characterize the push into Germany and the eventual surrender that awaited both armies at the war's bitter conclusion. The autumn of 1944 brought no swift resolution to the siege of Metz. Instead, it delivered something far more punishing, a slow, grinding war of attrition, where victory would be measured not in kilometers of dramatic advance, but in the incremental capture of forts, strongpoints, and rubble-choked streets. The soldiers who had swept across France in a blur of motion, who had imagined themselves unstoppable, now found themselves locked in a different kind of combat altogether. They were no longer the swift spear of mechanized warfare. They had become diggers, miners, and trench fighters, locked in a contest of endurance against an enemy that refused to collapse despite being surrounded, outnumbered, and cut off from the rest of Germany. The mud began to define their world more than any general's map could. Rain fell through October with the weight of permanence, turning the ground surrounding Metz into a cold, soupy morass that clung to boots and tracked endlessly into the damp foxholes where men huddled against the relentless chill. The mud was not merely a nuisance or a backdrop to combat. It was an enemy in itself, sapping energy, slowing movement, and making every meter of ground gained feel impossibly expensive. The reality of siege warfare bore no resemblance to the doctrine that had carried American forces across France. There were no grand sweeping movements here, no moments when a single audacious thrust could shatter an entire defensive line. Instead, there were limited assaults against carefully selected targets, each one planned with meticulous care, each one consuming men and material at rates that seemed almost obscene when measured against the modest territorial gains that resulted. A company would advance 200 meters in a day of intense fighting, purchasing that distance, with casualty figures that would have seemed unthinkable in the mobile campaigns of summer. The soldiers learned to pace themselves for a different kind of war, one that rewarded patience and caution over aggression and speed. The men who had grown accustomed to rapid maneuver, who had been trained to move fast and strike decisively, now had to relearn how to fight when movement was measured in meters rather than kilometers. Officers discovered that the tactics that had brought triumph in open terrain created only slaughter when applied to a fortified city. Machine gun fire from prepared positions could cut down advancing troops with mathematical precision. Artillery, once the striking arm of victory, became merely one tool among many in a protracted siege. The tempo of combat slowed to match the pace of entrenched defense, and soldiers learned that courage alone, no matter how abundant, could not overcome the advantage that prepared positions granted to their defenders. Cold became a constant companion as November approached, a silent antagonist that killed as surely as German bullets in some cases, though more slowly and less visibly. The temperatures dropped through the autumn weeks, and the rain mixed increasingly with sleet and then snow, transforming the bleak terrain around Metz into a world of grey and white, where exhausted men struggled simply to maintain body heat and prevent frostbitten feet and hands from becoming gangrenous. The soldiers wrapped themselves in whatever additional clothing they could scavenge, supplementing their standard issue with overcoats taken from the dead, blankets stolen from ruined houses, and newspaper stuffed inside uniforms for insulation. The cold sapped will as much as heat sapped endurance, creating a psychological burden that compounded the physical strain of continuous combat. Some men became so focused on warmth that the larger strategic situation receded from their consciousness. Others grew numb in ways that had nothing to do with temperature, their emotions cauterized by weeks of exposure to death and injury on a scale that the summer campaigns had not demanded. The medical stations behind the lines filled with cases of trench foot, exposure, and the peculiar exhaustion that came from prolonged combat in winter conditions. The casualty figures climbed steadily, though now cold and disease contributed as much as German fire to the daily toll of American strength. Water became as precious and problematic as warmth. The landscape around Metz, carved by the Moselle River and its tributaries, naturally collected water in every low point and depression. The constant rain and melting snow made every foxhole a potential water trap, forcing soldiers to bail constantly or risk drowning in increments as water accumulated around their positions. The water was inevitably contaminated, running through shell craters where the dead lay partially exposed, carrying disease as surely as it carried cold into the lungs of men forced to wade through it. Trench warfare, that relic of the First World War that American commanders had hoped to avoid through rapid mechanized movements, reasserted itself with grim familiarity. The soldiers faced conditions their grandfathers might have recognized from a quarter-century earlier, and the lessons learned from that earlier catastrophe seemed to offer little comfort. The men did not speak much of these hardships in official reports. Officers maintained the fiction that morale remained high and that American superiority in material would eventually crush German resistance. But in the letters home that censors read and filed away, in the diaries that men kept despite regulations against them, the truth emerged. This was a different kind of warfare, one that extracted a price measured in cold, mud, and incremental human degradation, rather than in the swift destruction of enemy forces. The forts that still held out became obsessions, each one a stubborn refusal to acknowledge American superiority. Fort Driant had been bloodied repeatedly, but remained largely in German hands, though at terrible cost to both sides. The various strongpoints dotting the landscape around the city, positions with names like Fort Nieder and Fort Belcroix, became the targets of methodical siege operations. Engineers would reconnoiter carefully, Artillery would pound the positions for hours, and then infantry would advance in waves, attempting to overwhelm the defenders through sheer weight of numbers and firepower. When the assault faltered, as they often did, the process would repeat. More shells, more men, more casualties, and incremental gains measured in the ability to establish firing positions from slightly closer ranges. The soldiers who conducted these assaults understood, at some level, that they were winning. The Germans could not be reinforced. The American forces continued to grow stronger, but that long-term logic offered small comfort to men freezing in foxholes, rationing ammunition, and watching friends disappear into the mud and blood of each new assault. Morale, that precious commodity that military leaders had learned was almost as important as ammunition, began to fray. American soldiers had been conditioned by their training and by the remarkable successes of the summer to believe that they were unstoppable, that American technology and doctrine guaranteed victory, that German resistance would crumble before superior force. Instead, they had encountered a German garrison that seemed willing to die rather than surrender, that used every advantage of terrain and fortification to exact maximum casualties for every advance the Americans made. The narrative of inevitable victory became harder to maintain. Replacement soldiers arrived from the rear, but they were often poorly trained, products of a rapid expansion of the American military machine that had prioritized speed over preparation. The veterans who trained these replacements had little confidence in their abilities, and that lack of confidence was transmitted through glances and brief warnings rather than through formal instruction. The soldiers also began to understand, in ways that the high command struggled to accept, that German soldiers could fight as well as Americans, that ideology and discipline could sustain resistance even in the face of overwhelming odds. The Germans defending Metz had chosen their ground with exceptional skill and had prepared their defenses with precision. They were not fanatics or madmen. They were soldiers doing their duty as they understood it. And that realization complicated the simple narrative of good versus evil that military propaganda had constructed. Supply lines, which had always been the shadow concern behind Patton's rapid advance, now became an acute problem. The distances from the factories and depots in America and Britain to the trenches around Metz stretched across the Atlantic and half of Europe. Every shell that was fired to reduce a German position had to be manufactured, shipped across the ocean, transported by rail and truck across liberated France, and finally delivered to the artillery pieces that fired it. The system worked, but only barely, and only through the sustained effort of tens of thousands of soldiers who never saw combat, but whose work was absolutely essential to the soldiers in the mud. Supply officers calculated daily how much ammunition could be expended in any given day's fighting, how many rations could be distributed, how much fuel could be allocated to trucks and tanks. These calculations were abstract to the soldiers in the trenches, but they shaped every decision that officers made about when and where assaults could be launched. A shortage of artillery ammunition might delay an assault planned for the morning, pushing it forward to afternoon when stocks could be replenished. Shortages of rations meant that men received less food, contributing to the decline in physical and mental endurance that siege warfare demanded they maintain. The German defenders faced their own supply crisis, but it was far more severe. They could not be reinforced, and any supplies that reached them had to come through increasingly tenuous lines, or through resupply operations that became more dangerous as American artillery increased in intensity. The German garrison was consuming supplies at rates that could not be sustained indefinitely, and every day that passed meant the garrison grew objectively weaker. Yet this mathematical certainty of eventual defeat seemed to only stiffen the resolve of the defenders. General Hermann Balck and his senior officers understood that they were in a race against time and logistics, as much as against American firepower. Their goal had shifted from the impossible dream of victory to the more achievable goal of maximum delay. Every day that Metz remained unconquered was a day that German forces elsewhere could reorganize, could prepare defenses further back, could attempt to stabilize the deteriorating situation on the broader German front. The soldiers knew this rationale as well, though not all of them accepted it with equal grace. Some questioned whether the lives being spent in Metz were truly buying enough time to justify the sacrifice. Others maintained faith that some turn in fortune would change the equation, that German reserves somewhere would arrive, and that this siege would be lifted as dramatically as it had begun. The soldiers' world contracted to the size of their unit, the distance they could see through artillery smoke and mud, the immediate section of trench or fortification where they spent their days, the grand strategy that had animated Patton's drive east, the vision of rapid victory through mechanized maneuver, seemed like something from a different war, one that had ended when Metz came into view. Men survived by focusing on the tasks immediately in front of them, maintaining their position, keeping their weapons clean despite constant moisture, rationing their food, husbanding ammunition, and trying to avoid being selected for the next assault. The soldiers who had been in continuous combat since Normandy showed the wear of months in the field. Their uniforms were stained beyond cleaning, their faces weathered by exposure and lack of proper rest, their eyes reflecting a weariness that came from fear, cold, and the accumulated stress of days spent in danger. Younger replacements, by contrast, had a different kind of gaunt expression, the shock of having experienced their first real combat and realizing how much pain and death were genuinely possible, how thin the margin was between advancing to capture an objective and being killed in the attempt. Officers tried to rotate units out of the line when possible, giving them periods of relative rest in rear areas, but the demands of the siege often made rotation impossible. Some units remained in the front lines for weeks on end, defending their sector and occasionally launching limited attacks when ordered. The violence, though never as graphically visible as it became in later wars, was nonetheless constant and psychologically corrosive. Shells arrived without warning, potentially killing anyone in their path. Mortar fire could drop suddenly into a concentration of men. Snipers identified any movement and attempted to kill anyone injudicious enough to expose themselves. The German defenders had excellent command of the terrain and had positioned their weapons with the precision that months of preparation permitted. Every American soldier understood that any moment could bring sudden death, and that knowledge wore at the mind in ways that courage could not fully overcome. The military attempted to manage this through rotation and rest, through the provision of alcohol and cigarettes in adequate quantities, through letters from home that were delivered with great effort to the forward positions. But nothing entirely compensated for the simple fact that a soldier's life in the trenches around Metz carried a constant threat that had become banal through repetition. The forts that dominated the landscape around Metz became emblems of the larger struggle, physical manifestations of human stubborn will to resist. These structures, some of them more than a century old, had been built in different eras and for different purposes, but they had been improved and adapted by the German defenders to meet the needs of modern warfare. They could withstand considerable artillery bombardment, and their stone and concrete walls provided protection that simple earthworks could not match. The American soldiers had to assault these positions repeatedly, and each assault that failed required a fresh assault to be planned and executed. The Germans, for their part, knew that they could not hold these forts forever, but every day of holding them was a victory of sorts, a refusal to capitulate to American superiority in numbers and material. The casualties sustained in these assaults affected both sides, though perhaps the Americans more severely, simply because the Americans were forced to attack while the Germans could defend. The mathematics of siege warfare favor the defender when the defender is willing to accept substantial casualties in exchange for delay and attrition among the attacking force. As November approached and the Ardennes offensive erupted far to the north, capturing the attention of senior commanders and creating new crises that demanded resolution, the siege of Metz settled into an almost routine horror. The Americans continued to advance slowly, measuring their progress in meters, in forts captured, in German survivors killed or captured. The Germans continued to resist, knowing now with certainty that no relief would come, that their choices had narrowed to surrender or death. The soldiers on both sides became locked in a struggle that transcended military strategy or grand operations, becoming instead a purely human contest between men who had no choice but to continue fighting. The romance of armored warfare, the dream of swift victory through superior force and audacity, had dissolved entirely into the mud and cold around Metz, replaced by a grinding, attritional struggle where triumph meant survival and victory meant merely being the side still standing when resistance finally ceased. By late autumn of 1944, the siege of Metz had settled into a grim war of attrition that showed no signs of rapid resolution. American forces had been battering at the city's defenses for nearly 3 months. Their initial confidence that a quick surrender would follow their rapid advance long since dissolved into the mud and blood of protracted combat. General Patton's impatience had not diminished, yet the military reality was inescapable. Metz would not fall to audacity and speed alone. The fortress city remained in German hands, its defenders still refusing capitulation despite overwhelming numerical disadvantage. And American casualties continued to mount with each passing week. Supply lines that had been stretched to the breaking point in September had gradually been restored through October and into November, yet the resources flowing forward were consumed by the unending hunger of siege operations, rather than fueling the rapid eastward drive Patton had envisioned. The campaign had become a test of endurance, not maneuver, a grinding competition between two armies locked in brutal proximity, neither able to deliver the decisive blow that would break the stalemate. For Patton, for his soldiers, and for the German garrison watching the autumn turn to winter, the situation had become one of frustration and resigned determination to continue fighting for objectives that seemed increasingly divorced from any larger strategic purpose. Into this stalemate, in the darkness before dawn on the 16th of December 1944, came news that would shatter the calculus of the entire Western Front. German forces, far to the north, near the Belgian border, had launched a massive surprise offensive through the Ardennes forest, striking directly at American and British lines that extended across the northern shoulder of the front. The scale of the German attack was staggering. More than 200,000 troops, backed by nearly 1,500 tanks and assault guns, crashed into American positions in weather so foul that Allied air power could not respond. Entire American divisions were surrounded or shattered in the opening hours of the assault, their lines collapsing as elite German panzer divisions raced forward toward the objectives that Berlin believed would unravel the entire Allied position in Western Europe. The German High Command had gambled everything on a desperate winter offensive, seeking not to win the war, but to achieve a stalemate that might allow negotiation. For American High Command, the news arrived like a thunderbolt. Suddenly, Metz was no longer the center of attention, and resources that had been slowly accumulating for the final reduction of the fortress city would now be diverted northward to contain and repel the German breakthrough. The implications of the German Ardennes offensive cascaded through American command structures with dizzying speed. Patton, whose Third Army occupied positions to the south and southeast of the German breakthrough, found his priorities completely reorganized in a matter of hours. Not only would the siege of Metz necessarily slacken as units and supplies were redirected northward, but Patton himself would be ordered to wheel his forces around and attack the German breakthrough from the south, a maneuver that would require extraordinary logistical coordination and rapid disengagement from the siege lines. The American general, who had resented every minute spent bogged down at Metz, now faced the paradox that the German offensive, for all its ferocity and threat to American positions, would in fact provide him with something closer to the mobile warfare he preferred. Yet the immediate consequence was chaos. Resources dried up, attention shifted away from Metz, and the American commanders responsible for the siege suddenly found themselves with fewer troops, less ammunition, and considerably less confidence that their efforts would soon produce a German surrender. The city that had consumed so much American effort and sacrifice seemed to fade overnight into secondary importance, as the great crisis of the Ardennes consumed the focus of generals and politicians alike. For the German garrison holding Metz, the news of the Ardennes offensive arrived like a resurrection of hope. General Hermann Balck and his subordinates, who had fought with desperate determination, knowing that they were merely buying time for German forces to stabilize the front further east, suddenly believed that time might yet produce strategic success. The German strategy at Metz had always rested on the assumption that holding the fortress would allow the Wehrmacht to recover from the chaos of the summer breakout and prepare defensive lines further east. Now, with German armor and infantry crashing through American positions in the Ardennes, it seemed briefly that the sacrifice at Metz might actually contribute to a German victory, or at the very least, a negotiated peace. The resolve of the German defenders, which had been fraying under months of American pressure, and the undeniable reality of German strategic defeat, suddenly hardened with renewed purpose. If the Ardennes offensive succeeded, if German forces could drive a wedge between the Americans and British and seize the critical supply port of Antwerp, then perhaps Metz's sacrifice would not be meaningless. German soldiers who had endured weeks of artillery bombardment, who had seen their fortified positions methodically reduced one by one, who had nursed their ammunition supplies while enemy shells fell in endless barrages, suddenly felt that their suffering might yet serve a greater purpose than merely delaying inevitable defeat. The German Ardennes offensive reached its maximum extent around the 19th of December, 3 days after the initial assault, when German panzer divisions had advanced nearly 100 kilometers into American territory and threatened to encircle vast numbers of American troops. Yet from the very beginning, the German advance had fallen short of its objectives, stalled by stubborn American resistance, atrocious weather that prevented the rapid exploitation German commanders had planned, and the speed with which American reinforcements could be brought forward. The famous encirclement of the American garrison at Bastogne, far from being a crushing victory, instead became a focal point where American troops held on, despite overwhelming siege conditions, waiting for relief that American armor promised to deliver. General Omar Bradley, Supreme Commander of American Ground Forces, made the critical decision to shift the weight of American strength northward, committing enormous resources to contain and then destroy the German breakthrough. This decision meant that Metz, despite remaining unconquered, would receive even fewer American resources and would cease to be a priority for American high command. The siege would continue, but at a reduced intensity, with smaller American forces required to hold the siege lines against a German garrison that, while weakened, could not be easily dislodged, as long as American attention was focused elsewhere. Yet the irony of the German Ardennes offensive was that its failure to achieve breakthrough and its eventual containment by American forces actually hastened the end of the siege at Metz. The German strategic gamble in the Ardennes represented the last significant concentration of mobile reserves that the Wehrmacht possessed, reserves that might otherwise have been used to reinforce Metz or attempt a breakthrough to relieve the fortress. By committing these forces to the Ardennes offensive, German High Command accepted that Metz would eventually fall, but hoped that the time bought by the garrison's sacrifice would prove decisive elsewhere. When the Ardennes offensive failed, when German armor was shattered in the snow and bitter cold, and American reinforcements stabilized the front, the strategic foundation that had supported the German defense at Metz collapsed. The garrison could no longer believe that their sacrifice was purchasing German strategic success. Instead, they faced the dawning realization that they were merely prolonging their own captivity or death for a cause that was clearly lost. The shift in American attention away from Metz, which might have seemed in the first days of December to offer the German garrison a reprieve, instead became a prelude to the final, grinding push that would bring American forces into the city's center and force the German evacuation of the fortress. Through the last weeks of December 1944 and into January 1945, the siege of Metz continued its grim trajectory, but with a changed character. American assaults resumed, though with less frequency and intensity than before, as American commanders remained focused on the Ardennes and the final destruction of the German breakthrough. Yet the arrival of additional American reinforcements to replace those diverted northward, combined with the gradual stabilization of American supply lines, meant that the slow, methodical reduction of German defensive positions continued regardless of dramatic events elsewhere on the map. The German garrison, which had endured the siege with the hope that German offensives elsewhere might change the strategic situation, now faced a future of endless American pressure with no prospect of relief or reinforcement. Ammunition supplies remained critically short, with German artillery pieces firing with increasingly harsh rationing as transport failed to bring forward new supplies. Food stocks dwindled, and the morale of troops who had fought so hard for months began to erode more rapidly once it became clear that the strategic justification for holding Metz had evaporated in the Ardennes. German commanders faced an agonizing choice: continue the defense in the growing certainty of eventual defeat, or begin the process of disengagement and withdrawal before American forces completed the encirclement of the fortress. The psychological impact of the Ardennes offensive on the soldiers locked in combat around Metz was profound and lasting. Though it operated in opposite directions for Americans and Germans, American troops, who had been frustrated and exhausted by months of siege operations, suddenly saw in the German breakthrough a larger purpose to their sacrifice. Holding their ground at Metz meant holding their ground against German forces that might otherwise be redeployed to strike at American vulnerability. The German breakthrough in the Ardennes, paradoxically, provided American soldiers at Metz with renewed motivation to continue the grinding, thankless work of siege warfare. For German defenders, the reverse was true. The collapse of the Ardennes offensive, the failure of the Great German Gamble, stripped away the last rationalization for continued resistance. Many German soldiers at Metz had believed, at least in the opening days of the Ardennes offensive, that their sacrifice might yet contribute to German strategic success. When that hope died in the snow and sleet of the Ardennes, when it became clear that American forces had not only contained the German breakthrough, but were already preparing to destroy it, the morale of the German garrison plummeted. German officers found themselves commanding troops who were no longer willing to die for abstract principles of military honor or Nazi ideology, but who simply wanted the siege to end and their ordeal to conclude, one way or another. The Ardennes offensive also exposed the fragility of German strategic planning and the desperation that underlay the decision to mount such a vast offensive in the first place. The German High Command's willingness to commit the last mobile reserves of the Wehrmacht to a winter campaign in the Ardennes, rather than using those reserves to reinforce threatened positions like Metz or to prepare defensive lines further east, demonstrated that Berlin believed German survival depended on dramatic action, not on patient defensive strategy. In choosing the Ardennes offensive, German military leadership implicitly accepted the inevitable loss of Metz and many other positions, betting everything on a single roll of the dice. Yet this acceptance, however much German commanders understood it intellectually, had not been communicated clearly to the garrison at Metz, who continued to fight with the belief that their sacrifice served a strategic purpose beyond mere delay. The revelation that German High Command had written off Metz in favor of the Ardennes offensive, once that offensive's failure became apparent, struck the German garrison with the force of betrayal. Soldiers who had endured months of bombardment, who had lived in flooded bunkers and rat-infested fortifications, who had watched friends and comrades fall to American artillery and machine gun fire, now understood that their sacrifice had purchased nothing of strategic value. As January 1945 began, the situation at Metz entered its final phase. Though neither American commanders nor the German garrison could yet recognize the fact, the siege continued, methodical and grinding, with American forces slowly reducing German defensive positions, and the German garrison slowly losing the will and the ability to resist. The Ardennes offensive, which had seemed at its outset to be a historical turning point, had instead become merely an episode that altered the timeline of Metz's fall without preventing it. American resources that had been redirected northward to contain the German breakthrough would, once that crisis passed, begin to flow back toward Metz, accelerating the final assault. German forces that might have been committed to Metz had instead been committed to the Ardennes and had been destroyed or rendered useless in the snow. The fortress city that had seemed so formidable in September, so capable of indefinite resistance, was now slowly dying, not from any dramatic American assault, but from the accumulation of small defeats, the exhaustion of resources, and the loss of strategic purpose. The men who held the German defensive lines around Metz still fought with discipline and courage, but they fought now not for victory, but merely for the hope that resistance might somehow be honorable, that sacrifice might somehow be remembered. Yet even these small consolations were being eroded by the passing days, the endless bombardment, and the growing certainty that the only question remaining was not whether Metz would fall, but when, and at what final cost. The winter of 1944 arrived at Metz not as a season of rest, but as an accelerant to despair. By mid-December, the garrison commanded by General Hermann Balck had already endured over 3 months of American assault, siege conditions that had transformed the fortress city into a world of rubble and exhaustion. The German defenders had held their position through September's failed American attacks, through October's grinding siege operations, and into November's methodical reduction of outlying strongpoints. They had paid a terrible price for their defiance, yet they had survived when all tactical logic suggested they should have been overrun. But survival, as the winter deepened, began to feel less like honor and more like punishment, a slow strangulation of a garrison that had nowhere to go and no prospect of relief. The Ardennes offensive, launched in the pre-dawn darkness of the 16th of December by German High Command with desperate hope and dwindling resources, initially created a shockwave of possibility In Metz's command bunkers, hundreds of kilometers to the north, German panzer forces had smashed through the American lines in the Ardennes region, creating what appeared to be a genuine breakthrough, a final gamble by a Wehrmacht that refused to accept its own extinction. For the first few days, as American forces scrambled to contain the penetration, and as radio operators transmitted urgent messages about the scale of the German attack, the defenders of Metz allowed themselves to imagine that the impossible might occur. Perhaps the American offensive against their city would be suspended. Perhaps reinforcements would be diverted northward to contain the German counterattack. Perhaps, in the chaos of the moment, Metz might be relieved, might receive the resupply and reinforcement that had been denied for 3 months. Those hopes, however fragile they were, rested on a fundamental misunderstanding of American strategic priorities and military capability. The American command structure, far from being paralyzed by the Ardennes crisis, had reacted with characteristic decisiveness and overwhelming force. General Dwight Eisenhower and his subordinates implemented contingency plans that had been drafted precisely for such an emergency, diverting forces to contain the German breakthrough while simultaneously maintaining pressure on German-held positions throughout the front. The American military machine, vast beyond the comprehension of the German High Command, possessed sufficient strength to fight the Ardennes offensive while continuing siege operations at Metz, to handle multiple crises at once, because it had access to resources that exceeded anything the Germans could muster. Within days of the Ardennes offensive's launch, it became clear that no American assault against Metz would be lifted, that the siege would continue with undiminished intensity, that no relief would arrive from any quarter. The realization crystallized slowly, like ice forming in a winter stream, as December passed and the Ardennes offensive reached its climactic moments. By the 26th of December, American forces had contained the German breakthrough, had stopped the panzer columns short of their objectives, and had begun to push back against the German salient, with the methodical coordination that characterized American military operations at their best. Metz's defenders, listening to radio reports and intercepting messages, understood what this meant. The Americans had beaten back the German offensive. No relief would come. No reinforcements would arrive to break the siege. The fortress city's garrison was now truly isolated, cut off not only from supplies and resupply, but also from hope itself. The futility of further resistance, which had lurked beneath the surface of German morale throughout the siege, now surfaced with overwhelming clarity. The choice was no longer between holding out for relief or surrendering with honor. It was between continued pointless sacrifice and pragmatic acceptance of inevitable defeat. German counterattacks, those occasional desperate lunges against American positions around the fortress city, ceased to occur with any regularity as December deepened. Where German forces had previously mounted localized offensives designed to disrupt American siege operations, to relieve pressure on particular strongpoints, to maintain psychological momentum through aggressive action, now only desultory patrols ventured forth from prepared defenses. The energy required for such attacks, the ammunition, the reserves of manpower, the will to mount offensive operations when every instinct screamed for conservation of strength, all of these had been consumed by months of continuous combat. American forces, by contrast, continued to pressure German positions methodically and relentlessly, expanding their control meter by meter, strongpoint by strongpoint, accumulating advantages that could not be reversed or recovered by any possible German action. The military balance, which had been precarious and dependent on German morale and American patience wearing out, had shifted decisively and irreversibly toward the Americans. The ammunition crisis, that had haunted German commanders throughout the siege reached its culmination as winter consumed the last weeks of defensive hope. For months, General Balk's forces had carefully rationed their artillery shells, had limited defensive fire to moments of genuine tactical necessity, had sought to maximize the psychological and material impact of every round expended. Supply lines, cut since the American breakout from Normandy, had never been restored. No convoys arrived through snow and ice bearing fresh ammunition. No trains rattled eastward from Germany, carrying the shells that would sustain defensive operations. The German garrison had been living off captured supplies, whatever ammunition could be scavenged from destroyed vehicles and captured American stocks, and the careful rationing of their own remaining reserves. By late December, even this arithmetic of desperation had exhausted itself. Ammunition stocks had fallen to levels where artillery batteries could fire only a handful of shells per day, where machine gunners received strict orders to use their weapons only against confirmed targets, rather than for suppressive fire. A defending army without ammunition is merely a garrison awaiting capture, and Metz's defenders now faced precisely that prospect. The cold of the European winter, which had tested every soldier regardless of nationality, became another instrument of German demoralization as December turned toward January. The fortress city's positions, which offered shelter from artillery fire and bombing, provided only marginal protection against the seeping, bone-deep cold that characterized a severe winter at this latitude. Soldiers huddled in bunkers and trenches, wrapped in whatever clothing they could acquire, burning fuel that was itself needed for other purposes to generate minimal heat. Frostbite became nearly as deadly as American bullets. Illness spread through the garrison, reducing combat effectiveness and adding to the load on already overwhelmed medical personnel. The Germans had endured such conditions before. Russia had taught them the extremes of winter warfare. But Russia had offered at least the prospect of reinforcement, of eventual relief, of strategic purpose beyond mere survival. Here at Metz, the cold served only to underline the hopelessness of their situation, to transform the garrison into a collection of suffering men waiting for an end they could no longer prevent. Reports filtering back to American intelligence officers and siege commanders confirmed what observers in the field had already begun to suspect. German morale within Metz had collapsed into something approaching complete demoralization. Captured prisoners spoke of despair, of certainty that the war was lost, of officers who acknowledged privately that further resistance was pointless, stragglers who made their way through American lines seeking to surrender, soldiers who attempted to slip away individually rather than continue the siege, became increasingly common. The quality of German defensive fire had declined noticeably in late December, suggesting that fewer soldiers were manning the positions with full commitment, that some German troops were simply going through the motions of resistance rather than fighting with genuine determination. The surrender mentality, once it begins to spread through a military garrison, becomes nearly impossible to reverse. A soldier who has accepted in his heart that his cause is lost will not fight with the ferocity required to hold prepared positions against an enemy that possesses superior numbers, superior firepower, and superior momentum. Yet surrender, even in the face of complete hopelessness, came slowly to the German garrison at Metz. The constraints that prevented outright capitulation were complex and operated at multiple levels. German officers, some of whom harbored deep concerns about what defeat might mean for Germany itself, showed varying degrees of willingness to continue the struggle. Some units within the garrison remained disciplined and committed to holding their positions. Ideological factors, the enduring belief in National Socialist ideology, and the certainty that surrender meant either death in captivity or trial for war crimes, motivated some defenders to fight on, regardless of military logic. German military tradition demanded resistance, and to surrender without orders from higher command could be construed as cowardice or dereliction of duty. The fortress city had been designated a strong point by German high command, which meant that its defense carried symbolic weight beyond its military significance. For all these reasons, the garrison at Metz continued to occupy its positions, to man its defenses, to resist American pressure, even as it became increasingly clear to nearly everyone that continued resistance would only prolong suffering without altering the ultimate outcome. The American commanders conducting the siege, understanding the psychological state of their enemy, adjusted their tactics to accelerate the collapse of German will without requiring massive assault operations that would have cost additional American casualties. Artillery bombardments continued, but the Americans had learned that the real weapon against a demoralized garrison was not shells, but time, patience, and the inexorable constriction of German positions. Each captured strongpoint meant that the next American assault would be mounted from positions closer to German defenders, from more advantageous terrain, against forces that had fewer places to retreat to. Each day that the siege continued meant another day without relief, another day to contemplate the futility of resistance, another day for rumors to spread about German defeats elsewhere, another day for hope to evaporate. American artillery and air power were used selectively, surgically, designed to degrade German positions without wasting ammunition on indiscriminate bombardment. This methodical approach, which would have frustrated Patton's impatient temperament, proved devastatingly effective against a garrison already losing faith in its own future. By late December, the German garrison at Metz existed in a state of suspended animation between continued military operations and inevitable surrender. American forces had seized most of the outlying forts and strongpoints that ringed the city proper. German-controlled territory had shrunk to the urban core, and a handful of still-defended positions scattered throughout the fortress complex. Escape routes had been systematically closed off by American forces, establishing roadblocks and defensive perimeters designed to prevent any breakout attempt or organized withdrawal. The fortress city, which had been transformed into a symbol of German resistance and American frustration, was now simply a cage from which German defenders had nowhere to go and no purpose remaining to go. Some soldiers continued to man their posts out of discipline, some out of ideological commitment, some out of simple force of habit. But the siege had become something other than a military contest. It had become a waiting period, a slow-motion conclusion to a campaign that had already been decided by forces larger than the willingness of any individual garrison to resist. The contrast between the earlier phases of the siege and this final crumbling of defenses could not have been more stark. In September, German defenders had mounted vigorous counterattacks, had inflicted severe casualties on American assault troops, had demonstrated a capacity for aggressive defense that had frustrated American commanders. By late December, the same soldiers occupying the same positions could barely muster sustained defensive fire. The difference was not courage, for soldiers do not lose courage between 1 month and the next, but rather the loss of something more fundamental, the belief that their sacrifices might influence events, that their deaths might achieve something more than pointless prolongation of an already lost war. That loss of purpose, more than American firepower or mathematical advantage in manpower, was what truly broke the siege of Metz. The fortress city would fall not because its walls were stormed or its defenders killed en masse, but because those defenders would finally accept what every map and every radio report and every rational assessment of the situation had already confirmed. The war was lost, their garrison was hopeless, and further resistance could only mean additional suffering for no possible gain. Hashtag. The autumn mud of northeastern France had turned to winter slush by the final weeks of November 1944. For nearly 3 months, American forces had poured men, ammunition, and equipment into the struggle for Metz, a medieval fortress city that had resisted every attempt at rapid reduction. The German garrison, commanded by General Hermann Bulck and his subordinates, had inflicted casualties on a scale that seemed disproportionate to the size of the objective itself. And yet, as November drew toward its close, the iron discipline that had sustained the German defense began to show signs of fracture. Supplies dwindled. Ammunition reserves grew perilously thin. The constant pressure of American artillery, the relentless advance of American infantry through the surrounding forts, and the knowledge that no relief would ever come, all of this accumulated weight bore down upon defenders who had held out far longer than anyone had predicted they could. By the 22nd of November, resistance in some sectors had collapsed entirely. By the 25th, German commanders faced the inescapable reality that further defense was not merely futile, but wasteful of lives that could not be replaced. General George Patton received word of the city's impending surrender with the satisfaction of a commander who had maintained his vision against considerable doubt. For 3 months, subordinates and superiors alike had questioned the wisdom of committing resources to a siege operation that seemed fundamentally at odds with Patton's entire philosophy of mechanized warfare. The supply crisis that had paralyzed his Third Army's advance toward Germany had been attributed, at least partly, to the resources consumed by the Metz campaign. Planners at higher headquarters had suggested alternatives, containing the city with minimal forces and pressing forward. Yet Patton had refused to leave a fortified German position in his rear, convinced that it would tie down troops and threaten supply lines. And in the end, his judgment proved correct, though the margin of success was far narrower than his confidence had suggested. The fall of Metz vindicated the commanding general's resolve, even if it did not validate his preferred style of warfare. On November the 25th, Patton issued a statement announcing the capture of the city, framing it as another triumph in the sequence of victories that had defined his campaign across France. But triumph, in the lexicon of military operations, can mean very different things to different observers. To Patton and his staff, the capture of Metz represented proof that American determination and material superiority could overcome even prepared defenses held by experienced troops. The Third Army had advanced to the very threshold of Germany itself, despite supply difficulties and determined enemy resistance. Cities that had seemed unreachable in September had fallen by November. The Wehrmacht's vaunted defensive capacity had been tested and found wanting, at least in this sector. From the perspective of American High Command and the War Department, Metz's fall removed an obstacle that had consumed far too much time and too many casualties for a secondary objective. The city had tied up approximately 100,000 American soldiers for nearly 12 weeks, during which those same troops might have been deployed to other critical sectors of the front. The opportunity cost of the Metz campaign could not be measured only in casualties, though those were substantial enough, but in the strategic possibilities foregone elsewhere along the line. The German garrison, by contrast, understood their surrender not as a defeat, but as the inevitable conclusion of a campaign in which they had never possessed any realistic hope of victory. Under General Bulck's command, the forces in and around Metz had absorbed punishment on a terrifying scale, while inflicting significant losses on their attackers. The forts that ringed the city, Fort Driant, Fort Saint-Privat, and dozens of lesser strongpoints had been reduced one by one through American assault and artillery bombardment, each reduction costing lives on both sides. German soldiers had fought not in hopes of achieving victory, but rather in hopes of buying time for the front to stabilize further east, for reinforcements to arrive, for some German strategic initiative to create breathing room. None of these hopes had materialized. The Ardennes offensive, launched in December by Hitler in a final desperate gamble to split the American and British forces, was still weeks away when Metz's defenders surrendered, and even that offensive would ultimately prove incapable of altering the fundamental strategic imbalance. In surrendering Metz, German commanders were acknowledging not just the loss of a city, but the confirmation of a bitter truth. The war was lost, and all that remained was to determine the shape and scope of the defeat. What Patton had achieved at Metz was real, yet it bore little resemblance to the sort of victory his aggressive temperament most valued. The rapid maneuver victories of the summer and early fall, the breakthrough at Saint-Lô, the encirclement at Falaise, the sweep across the Loire Valley, these had vindicated everything Patton believed about the proper conduct of warfare. Speed, audacity, exploitation of tactical openings, and relentless pressure had allowed small numbers of American troops to achieve outsized results against an enemy reeling from unexpected collapse. Metz, by contrast, had demanded something closer to the opposite of these virtues: patience, methodical reduction of successive strongpoints, the slow accumulation of incremental gains through grinding attrition. The American forces that finally secured the city in late November had done so not through bold maneuver, but through sheer persistence, through an overwhelming commitment of firepower and bodies to the problem of forcing a reluctant enemy to yield territory. It was a victory that would have been comprehensible to generals from an earlier era, to commanders who had besieged Vicksburg or Atlanta or Petersburg, but to a commander who had built his reputation on the possibilities of lightning war. It must have seemed like a betrayal of everything he understood to be true about modern warfare. The human cost of this victory was written in casualty lists that spoke more honestly than any official communique could manage. American forces had suffered approximately 7,000 casualties, killed, wounded, or missing, in the struggle for Metz. German casualties, though difficult to calculate with precision, were estimated at similar or perhaps somewhat higher levels, though many German soldiers who had been surrounded in the final weeks had been captured rather than killed. 7,000 casualties represents a staggering cost for a secondary objective, particularly when set against the broader context of the European campaign. These were not the casualties of a war of maneuver, where success comes quickly and defeats can be avenged in the next engagement, but rather the casualties of a siege, where each day of continued resistance exacts a fresh toll and there is no possibility of dramatic reversal. The soldiers of the American Third Army and their German opponents had bled into the mud of the Moselle Valley and the ravines surrounding Metz's forts, and that blood had purchased nothing more or less than the territory itself. There was no strategic windfall, no opportunity for exploitation, no moment of spectacular breakthrough that might reshape the campaign as a whole. The city itself, when American forces finally secured full control, presented a world of destruction that bore testimony to the intensity of the struggle. Metz's medieval streets, its ancient cathedral, its centuries-old fortifications, had all borne the marks of modern warfare. Artillery bombardment had shattered buildings, reduced strongpoints to rubble, and transformed the urban landscape into something barely recognizable. The German garrison, knowing that surrender was inevitable, had neither destroyed the city comprehensively in a final act of defiance, nor preserved it intact as a symbol of German cultural heritage. Instead, Metz bore the scars of compromise, of a campaign that had dragged on long enough to inflict serious damage, but not so long as to produce total destruction. American soldiers who entered the city in late November encountered a population shell-shocked by months of warfare, subjected to intermittent bombardment, cut off from supplies, and living amid ruins that served as constant reminders of the cost of Nazi Germany's decision to resist rather than surrender. The city represented a kind of Pyrrhic victory, even before the casualty figures were fully compiled. Patton's response to the fall of Metz was to immediately pivot toward the next objective, already planning his next offensive operation and calculating how rapidly his Third Army could resume the advance toward the Rhine. In Patton's mind, the Metz campaign was already receding into the past, a problem that had been solved, an obstacle that had been cleared away. He had no patience for regrets or for reflection on whether the cost had been worth the prize. His gaze was fixed firmly on the future, on the opportunities that lay ahead for a commander whose army possessed superiority in numbers, equipment, and command quality. The supplies that had been committed to the Metz campaign would, he believed, eventually be replaced as American logistical capacity improved. The casualties would be replenished with new replacements, and the momentum, which he felt had never truly been lost despite the 3-month delay, could be resumed with renewed vigor. In this, Patton was almost surely correct in the narrow military sense. The fall of Metz did remove an obstacle to further advance, and the Third Army would in fact resume its eastward movement in the weeks and months that followed. Yet the very ease with which Patton moved past the Metz campaign reflected a certain blindness to what the campaign had revealed about the limits of his preferred methods. The victory at Metz had come at such cost and consumed such time, partly because Patton's initial assumptions about how rapidly the city would fall had proven catastrophically wrong. In September, when American forces first approached Metz's outer defenses, expectations within the Third Army had run high. The city was surrounded, cut off from German-held territory, defended by a garrison that seemed small relative to the forces arrayed against it. Surely, the logic went, a city so isolated could be compelled to surrender within days. Instead, the garrison had fought with a discipline and determination that confounded these expectations. The fortress system that surrounded Metz, rather than being a relic from an earlier age that modern warfare had rendered obsolete, proved to be a formidable asset in the hands of defenders willing to use it. And the terrain of northeastern France, far from facilitating rapid maneuver, had proven as constraining as any landscape in the European theatre. The Moselle River